Everything began with a call in the middle of the night, interrupting the little sleep I managed between missions. The persistent ringing of the phone felt like an omen of something bad, and I was not mistaken.
Captain Rivera, we have a critical situation. A group of missionaries has been kidnapped by rebels in the Congo jungle. We need your team ready to depart in 2 hours. The voice of my commander was grave, each word loaded with urgency. That day, the sky was dyed a leaden gray, as if foreshadowing the darkness of our mission. We headed to the heart of a jungle I knew too well, a place where every shadow could hide an enemy and every sound could be the last you hear. The flight to the insertion point was tense. Beside me, my elite team, men and women forged in countless battles, each with their gaze fixed on the void, lost in their own thoughts. We knew this wouldn't be an ordinary mission. The lives of those innocents hung by a thread every second we spent in the air. Upon arrival, the jungle greeted us with its humid, suffocating embrace. The sound of wildlife mixed with the distant echo of gunshots, a constant reminder of the danger lurking in the thicket. We advanced cautiously, each step calculated, each movement rehearsed to perfection. "I don't like this, Cap," murmured Sanchez, my second in command, while inspecting the terrain with his sharp gaze. "These guys know the terrain better than anyone. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, if the needle shot back." I patted him on the shoulder, trying to convey some assurance that I didn't feel myself. "We're going to get them out of there, Sanchez. Alive." The afternoon gave way to night, and with it, the jungle transformed. The sounds were more intense. The eyes of small predators shone in the darkness, watching every one of our movements. We communicated with hand signals, each as silent as a ghost's shadow. It was then that we saw it, a small, almost imperceptible light among the dense foliage. "There," I pointed, and my team regrouped, preparing for what was to come. The rebel camp was crudely fortified, with sentries scattered around. We observed, calculated. The lives of the hostages depended on every decision we made in those moments. "Rodriguez, Martinez, flank left. Sanchez, you're with me. The rest, cover our backs." My orders were whispered, but each knew exactly what to do. The assault was a whirlwind of chaos and precision. Gunshots, screams, the dull sound of bodies hitting the ground. Amid the pandemonium, we found the missionaries tied and gagged but alive. Their large, frightened eyes reflected the terror of days of captivity. "Let's go! Let's go!" I shouted as we cut their bindings and guided them out of the camp. Each step towards freedom was a race against time, every second a precious gift. We finally reached the extraction point, the sound of the helicopter resonating like the sweetest music I had ever heard. We climbed aboard, and as the jungle faded below us, I allowed relief to seep in for the first time. The missionaries cried and prayed, grateful for the miracle of their rescue. I looked at my team, each face marked by the effort of the march, but with an expression of satisfaction that only comes after fulfilling the most arduous duty. Sanchez, with a cut on his eyebrow that barely seemed to bother him, gave me a gentle pat on the shoulder. "We did it, Cap. We got them out." I nodded, feeling the weight of every life we had touched that night. But the mission wasn't over yet. We had to return to the base, ensure the missionaries received the necessary medical attention, and report the details of the encounter. The adrenaline began to dissipate, leaving in its place the fatigue and aftermath of the combat. Once at the base, the doctors took over, tending to the physical wounds of the rescued. We, on the other hand, had to face our own, those not always visible at first glance. Debriefings with intelligence officers followed one after another, each question an excavation deeper into the fresh memories of the jungle. "Captain Rivera, was there any moment when you felt the mission could fail?" asked an officer with a notebook in hand. I looked at my comrades, recalling each face in the darkness, every decision made with intertwined hope and fear. "There's always a moment," I responded sincerely, "but I trust my team. We know every mission could be the last, and that unites us more than anything." The following days were a blur of reports, meetings, and brief ceremonies. The missionaries were sent back to their home countries, each carrying a part of that dark jungle in their hearts, just like us. The news briefly covered the rescue, a segment among many others. But for us, the details would always remain vivid, every sound and shadow etched in our memory. Eventually, routine resumed. Training, preparations for the next mission, life at the base with its small daily occurrences. But at night, when the world seemed silent and distant, my mind returned to the jungle. I could hear the murmur of the leaves, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, the whisper of rain on the canopy. Those moments reminded me why we did what we did, not for medals or headlines, but for the chance to lend a hand in the darkest places, to bring light to the deepest shadows. Each rescue, each mission changed us, molded us into something more than soldiers. We were guardians, protectors in the chaos. Looking back, I know that every choice led us exactly where we needed to be at that moment, in that jungle. And though the future was uncertain, one thing remained clear. There would always be a call in the night, and we would always answer. Because in the silence between each battle, in the echo of each gunshot, we found our reason for being. Not only were we saving lives, we were discovering the depth of our own humanity. Thus, among the memories and shadows, between reality and dreams, we moved forward. Because in the end, what defines us is not how we start the story, but how we choose to fill the pages that remain. Sweat ran down my forehead as I crouched behind the dilapidated wall of what was once a school in the city of Mosul. Dust and the smell of gunpowder mixed in the hot air, creating an almost unbearable atmosphere. It was the third day of an offensive that was supposed to be quick, but nothing in war is predictable. It was night, though the sky was lit by flames and explosions resounding in the distance. Beside me, Martinez cradled his rifle, looking through the broken window, trying to decipher shadows in the darkness. "Do you think they'll pass the night, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice denoting more curiosity than fear. "I hope so, soldier. We have to hold the position until dawn," I replied, though in my mind I doubted every decision made so far. Suddenly a subtle noise, almost drowned out by the distant roar of mortars, caught our attention. Footsteps. Someone was approaching. I signaled Martinez to be ready, and we both aimed at the small entrance, still hanging from its hinges. "Identify yourself!" I shouted, my voice as firm as I could make it. The footsteps stopped, a moment of silence. Then a trembling voice responded, "Please don't shoot. We are civilians." My heart raced. Civilians. We were not prepared for this. With a hand gesture, I lowered my weapon and cautiously peeked out. Before us stood a woman holding a child in her arms and two teenagers at her side, revealed under the dim moonlight. They were dirty, scared, and clearly exhausted. "We are seeking refuge," the woman explained, her voice laden with desperation. "Please help us." I looked at Martinez, seeking any objection, but found the same doubt consuming me in his eyes. Our mission was clear: hold the position and secure the area. But how could we ignore those needing help because of the conflict we were fighting? "All right, come in quickly," I finally said, stepping aside to let them pass. The family hurried in, looking around with fear, but with a glimmer of relief. Once inside, the woman told me her story. They lived a few streets away, and their home had been destroyed in a recent bombing. "We just want to survive this," she whispered, holding her child tighter. We spent the night awake, alternating guard duty while the family rested in a corner of the building. Every noise, every moving shadow in the darkness brought a new peak of tension. We not only had to stay alert for the enemy, but were also responsible for innocent lives. At dawn, the radio crackled with anxious voices asking for reports and updates. I reported our situation, mentioning the presence of the civilians. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that seemed to stretch for hours. "Understood, Sergeant. Hold your position, but ensure those civilians are evacuated at the first opportunity." The relief was momentary, knowing the real test was yet to come. Over the next hours, as the sound of combat intensified, we coordinated a plan to move the family to a safer place. Each decision was a delicate balance between fulfilling our mission and not putting civilians at unnecessary risk. Finally, the time for evacuation came. With the help of reinforcements, we escorted the family through labyrinthine streets and smoldering ruins. It has been a long time since I stopped counting the days since that first contact. Memory plays tricks, especially when it tries to protect you from too dark memories. However, certain images remain vivid in my mind, as if they were etched with fire. I was the leader of a small military expedition sent to explore a little-known region of the Amazon jungle. The objective was clear: secure the area for future scientific studies. However, what we found there was something no military training could have prepared me for. Our first encounter with the tribe was accidental. We were following a river that snaked through the dense vegetation when we saw them. Figures barely visible among the thicket, moving with a grace that could only develop after generations living in perfect symbiosis with the natural environment. At first, I thought they would flee, but they approached with curiosity, though with palpable caution. Their adornments were simple but meaningful, and their eyes reflected a mix of wisdom and wariness. "Hello, we come in peace," I said in Spanish, doubting they could understand me. Surprisingly, one of them, an old man with a face marked by deep wrinkles, responded in rudimentary Spanish. "Peace, yes, come with us." They led us to their village, a set of structures that seemed a natural extension of the jungle itself. There we were received with a mix of hospitality and reserve. They offered us a plant-based drink and invited us to sit in a circle. The old man who spoke some Spanish introduced himself as Aruka. He explained that they rarely saw outsiders and that the jungle was a sacred place, full of spirits and ancient forces. Then his tone turned grave. "But there is also darkness here," he said, looking at each of us intently. "An ancient evil sleeping deep in the jungle. You must not awaken it." My men exchanged nervous glances. It was evident that the old man's words caused them unease, though none wanted to admit it. "What kind of evil?" I asked, driven by a mix of skepticism and a disturbing premonition. Aruka closed his eyes as if recalling the details caused him pain. "It is an ancient entity, a soul devourer. Our ancestors trapped it in a hidden place marked by black stones. No member of our tribe goes near that place. It is taboo." The temptation to explore and document the site was immediate among my men, but something in Aruka's warning made me hesitate. That night we discussed our options. Most were in favor of following the protocol, securing the area, and avoiding any alteration. However, curiosity prevailed, and at dawn, we decided to search for the place described by Aruka. We delved deeper into the jungle, guided by the vague indications we had managed to extract from the rest of the tribe. After hours of marching, we found the black stones. They were arranged in a circle with intricate carvings, unlike anything we had seen before. "I don't like this, Captain," murmured Garcia, one of my most experienced subordinates. "This is not something natural. It's as if these stones breathed." Ignoring the instinct to retreat, I decided we needed to investigate further. Inside the circle, the air felt colder, denser. Each step seemed to require more effort, as if an invisible force pushed us back. Suddenly, one of the soldiers screamed. We all turned to see him fall to the ground, convulsing violently. I ran to him, but before I could reach him, his body stopped moving. His gaze was fixed, empty, as if something had ripped the life out of him from within. Panic seized the group. "We have to get out of here!" Martinez shouted, grabbing another soldier by the arm and pulling him back. But before we could take another step, a dense, oscillating shadow emerged from the center of the stone circle. It was a black mass, almost ethereal, moving with disturbing agility. "Form a circle, aim at the center," I ordered, trying to maintain calm amid the chaos. The men obeyed, but their hands trembled, their rifles aimed at a shadow that seemed to mock our weapons. The entity expanded, growing in intensity and darkness. I felt the air compressing around us, as if trying to crush us. Just when I thought all was lost, Aruka appeared at the edge of the stone circle, flanked by several elders of the tribe. "You must leave this place!" shouted the old man, advancing towards the entity with an object in his hand that emitted a faint glow. It was some kind of amulet carved with the same symbols as the stones. The shadow writhed as if the presence of the amulet disturbed it. Aruka began to chant in his native tongue, a melody that sounded both like a lament and a warning. The other elders joined, their voices rising above the entity's threatening whisper. Little by little, the shadow began to diminish, retreating as if the chant and amulet burned it. Finally, with a final scream that echoed in the jungle, the entity disappeared, leaving only the cold and an overwhelming silence behind. Aruka approached us, his face grave. "You should not have come here," he said simply. "This evil is ancient and must not be disturbed. Your friend has paid the price for this transgression." They guided us back to the village, where our comrade's body was prepared for the return journey. The tribe offered purification rituals for us, trying to cleanse the dark touch we had experienced. We accepted, not out of belief, but from a deep sense of needing to rid ourselves of the heaviness oppressing our chests. When we finally left the jungle, the silence between us was palpable. No one wanted to speak of what had happened. We reported it as an encounter with unidentified hostile forces, knowing that the truth was something even we did not fully understand. I returned home weeks later, but the peace I hoped to find eluded me. Every shadow in the corner of my room reminded me of the entity. Every whisper of the wind brought echoes of Aruka's chant. I learned that there are places in this world beyond our understanding and control, and that there are lines that should never be crossed. Sometimes on the darkest nights, when the wind moves the leaves outside my window, I can hear a whisper, a distant lament, and I know that though I have left the jungle behind, it will never completely leave me. It all began with the drizzle that wouldn't stop and the overcast sky that greeted us upon our arrival. At first, it seemed like just another mission in the dense jungle of South America, one of the many we had faced as part of our military duties. But nothing had prepared us for what we would find. It was a typically humid day, and the jungle seemed to devour every sound except the constant dripping of rain on the leaves. My squad, composed of 5 rugged and battle-hardened men, ventured into the vegetation to recon a reported rebel base area. "Do you really think these guys are here, Sergeant?" Harris asked while securing his backpack over his shoulders. "Don't let your guard down. Reports indicate a lot of activity in this area over the past weeks," I replied, adjusting the radio on my belt. We hadn't advanced much when we realized we were surrounded. Dozens of armed men emerged from the trees like ghosts. Before we could react, they had captured us. I was struck on the head and everything went black. I woke up tied to a wooden structure, my wrists sore and my head pounding. In front of me, a man with an intense gaze and scruffy beard watched us with curiosity. It was him, the rebel leader we had heard so much about, known for his charisma and cruelty in equal measure. "Who are you really, and what are you looking for here?" His voice was calm but firm. I tried to respond, but confusion and fear muddled my words. Over the following days, that man, whom they called the commander, would sit with us, talk about his ideals, and criticize everything we stood for. Some of my men began to listen to him, nodding during his speeches. Weeks had passed since our capture. The line between enemy and ally began to blur. Harris, who was once the most skeptical, now seemed fascinated by the commander. "He's changing everything I thought, Sergeant," he confessed one afternoon, looking towards the dense jungle as if seeking answers among the trees. "Don't get carried away, Harris. Remember who we are and what we swore to protect," I warned him, though deep down, the influence of the rebel leader also began to infiltrate my thoughts. The loyalty of my men was fractured, and I knew that if we didn't act soon, the situation could become irreversible. One night, while the commander celebrated some kind of victory with his followers, I whispered a plan to my remaining men to escape. "It's now or never," I said, cutting the bindings on my wrists with a small knife I had managed to hide. We moved stealthily through the shadows, avoiding guards until we reached the edge of the camp. But just when freedom seemed possible, Harris hesitated. "I can't, Sergeant. I think the commander is right. What if we're on the wrong side of history?" His internal conflict was palpable, But there was no time for philosophical debates. With a sorrow that still haunts me, I had to leave him behind. With a heavy heart and adrenaline surging through my veins, I continued the escape with the remaining men. The jungle had never been as threatening as that night, every sound magnified by fear and desperation. After hours of an exhausting escape, we finally found a friendly outpost where we were received with astonishment and relief. Our emaciated faces and exhausted bodies spoke more than 1,000 words. We reported the situation, including the difficult decision to leave Harris behind, and soon a rescue mission was organized, though with little hope of success given the terrain's complexity and the commander's cunning. Back at the base, life did not return to normal for any of us. The days were a mix of debriefings, counseling sessions, and long nights haunted by nightmares and memories of the jungle. The doubt the commander had planted in us grew silently, fueling discussions and disagreements among the team. One afternoon, I received the call I had been dreading but hoping for. They had found Harris, alive but not whole. He had been left on one of the known patrol routes, almost as if the commander wanted us to find him. When Harris returned, his gaze had changed. There was a new depth in his eyes, a mix of remorse and something unfathomable that I couldn't interpret. The first days were difficult. He avoided talking about the time after our separation and was evasive with details. One afternoon, I decided to confront the situation. We sat with the jungle still resonating in the back of our minds and talked. "Harris, I need you to tell me what happened," I insisted. In a low voice, almost a whisper, he began to recount his experience after our separation. The commander had taken him under his wing, showing him a vision of the world that challenged everything we had learned and believed. It wasn't just manipulation. It was a complete re-education. I thought I could understand, Sergeant. I believed that maybe, in some corner of this madness, there was some truth in his words, Harris confessed. Harris's story stirred a storm at the base. Some saw his return and words as proof of the enemy's manipulation. Others, like me, began to question not just our mission, but the righteousness of our actions. I decided to investigate more about the commander and his ideals. Among confiscated documents and testimonies from other liberated prisoners, the layers of truth became more complex and contradictory. War, I learned the hard way, is never black and white. Months later, with the mission officially completed, the squad disbanded. Each carried the scars of those days in the jungle and the lessons learned from an enemy who had not only fought us but also changed us. Harris retired from active service, seeking peace in a small town far from the world's hustle, while I decided to dedicate my life to diplomacy, hoping to find solutions in words before weapons. And so, as I write these lines with the rain tapping on my window, remembering those days in the dense jungle, I wonder if we will ever fully understand what we lived through. But one thing is certain. The jungle changed us, and perhaps in some twisted sense for the better. Since time immemorial, I have remained here, extending my roots deep into the earth and my branches toward the sky. I have witnessed the passage of countless creatures, from the smallest ants to the largest predators. But recently, I have felt the arrival of a new species of predators, humans. Specifically, a group of soldiers who have come to invade my space, to destroy my peace with their machines and weapons. It all began when they established their first camp. They tore down my youngest trees to make way, their boots trampling my delicate flowers and their hands cutting my vines. From the first moment, I knew they were not mere visitors but a threat. "Prepare yourselves, guys. This jungle is hostile, but we are tougher," said the commander as he ordered his men to deploy their equipment. I watched and listened, waiting for the right moment to act. One night, while the men slept, I decided to communicate with them. My leaves whispered in the wind, and my branches creaked under the weight of my anger. "Did you hear that?" murmured one of the soldiers, startled. "It's just the wind, don't be a coward," replied another, though his voice trembled slightly. I took advantage of that initial fear to sow doubts and discord among them. Each night, the sounds intensified, becoming more disturbing and less natural. To heighten their terror, I began to manipulate the shadows. Shapes that seemed human moved among the trees, barely perceptible at the edge of sight. One day, a young soldier who ventured too far from his camp found himself face to face with a jaguar. But it was no ordinary jaguar. It was one of my protective spirits, transformed to frighten him. "Stop! Did you see that? It was huge!" he shouted, as he ran back to the camp, pale as the moon. His comrades ridiculed him, but the seed of fear had already been planted. One night, I decided to escalate my offensive. The winds blew harder, and the rain fell like furious tears from the dark sky. The soldiers, disoriented and scared, began to lose their sanity. One of them, delirious, claimed to have seen his comrades being devoured by the plants. "The plants! The plants are eating us alive!" he screamed before his friends managed to calm him. But that night, the earth itself swallowed one of them. It took him underground amid screams and pleas. No one saw him again. With the group dwindling and morale plummeting, I decided to interfere with their communications. Radios that only transmitted static suddenly emitted ghostly voices, messages urging them to leave or warnings of their imminent doom. "What's happening here? This isn't normal. We need to leave," said one, almost crying. "We can't abandon the mission," insisted the commander, though his voice no longer held the same firmness. In their desperation, they began to accuse each other of being the cause of the curse that had befallen them. Fights broke out, and in one of them, a soldier was pushed into a hidden pit among my roots. The screams silenced as soon as he hit the dark bottom. The commander, finally broken, ordered the retreat. The few remaining collected their weapons and began to flee through the dense undergrowth, tripping over vines I had strategically placed in their path. Some fell exhausted, unable to continue, while others simply disappeared into the shadows, absorbed by my branches and the ground beneath them. As the sun began to rise, tinted red like the blood that had been spilled that night, only two remained: the commander and his second-in-command, both physically and emotionally destroyed, barely recognizable as the men who had entered my territory with such arrogance and disdain. "What have we done to deserve this?" asked the second, his voice barely a whisper. "We invaded their home," replied the commander, comprehension finally dawning on him in his last moments of lucidity. "We are the intruders here." With that final admission of guilt, I ended my hunt. I allowed them to find the way out, a small path I had kept hidden. I watched them as they stumbled away, their bodies and spirits broken. Once they were gone, silence returned to my domain. The wounds they had inflicted would begin to heal with time, and I would continue to grow, flourish, and evolve as I had done for eons. However, this experience would be remembered, not as an act of vengeance, but as a vital lesson about respect and balance. If other humans dared to disturb my peace again, they would know that I am not merely a collection of trees and plants, but a living entity capable of protecting itself. In the distance, the sounds of wildlife returned to fill the air. Howler monkeys marked their territory, and birds sang melodies that spoke of a new day. Life has always found its way in my green heart under the sun filtering through my dense canopy. Thus, I am the eternal and ever-vigilant jungle, a mysterious world where every leaf and creature has a purpose, and where intruders learn that this sacred place must be respected for the good of all beings who call it home. My name is Alfonso. I am a native of the Dominican Republic, and I enlisted in the army at the age of 18. The story I am going to tell may seem unbelievable, but for me, it was real. It all began in a remote place called Los Haitises, a virgin and little-explored national park in the Dominican Republic. My team was composed of Rodriguez, Alejandro, Alex, Luis, and Raul, all with extensive military experience. During a jungle exploration mission, night fell, and we decided to camp. We needed water, so I volunteered to go to the nearby river on horseback since the terrain conditions did not allow for other means of transportation. Upon reaching the river and filling the water buckets, I heard a strange noise. I felt as if something had fallen from a nearby palm tree, and I became alert, thinking it could be an infiltrating enemy. When I was about to mount the horse to return to the camp, the animal would not move. At that moment, I remembered that it is said that horses perceive negative energy and stay still when there is danger. The noise came again, and I panicked. I looked around and saw a large, dark figure standing about 5 meters away from me. When I turned back to the horse, I noticed a wound on its neck as if a claw had slashed it. Filled with panic, I ran back to the camp. Along the way, I felt as if something invisible was grabbing my legs and temples. At one point, one of these forces twisted my ankle, making the journey even more difficult. I crawled to the camp and my companions came out to help me. I told them what had happened, and although they initially doubted my story, Raoul and I decided to return to the site to investigate. Upon arriving, we found the horse seemingly unharmed. My companions started joking, suggesting that I was imagining things since there were only overturned buckets on the ground. Days passed without incident until one night when I went to check on the horse, I noticed that its eyes were dark and deep with a strange reddish tone. The horse was restless, and when I brought my companions to show them, we found the horse dead, with the neck wound that had previously disappeared. The tension in the camp increased, but we continued with our mission. One night, while on guard duty, we heard footsteps around the camp. We prepared for a possible attack, but we saw no one. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and we heard a terrifying whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rodriguez suggested that we retreat and return to the barracks, but Alejandro insisted that we should complete the mission. We decided to stay alert and continue. That same night, a blood-curdling scream woke us all. We came out of the tents and found Alex on the ground, trembling and pointing towards the jungle. In the darkness, we glimpsed a tall, thin figure with bright red eyes watching us. We fired at the figure, but it vanished into the darkness. Alex could not speak about what he saw, but his eyes reflected deep terror. We decided to abandon the camp at dawn. We gathered our things and started the return journey, but the atmosphere was oppressive, as if something or someone was following us. We walked in silence, feeling a constant presence around us. Upon reaching a clearing, we encountered a disturbing scene. There were ancient symbols carved into the trees and remnants of what seemed to be ancient rituals. Rodriguez, who had knowledge of indigenous cultures, recognized the symbols as warning and protection marks. We realized that we had invaded a sacred place, and perhaps the figure we had seen was the guardian of that site. We quickened our pace, but we felt that the figure was following us. Suddenly, Alejandro fell to the ground, screaming that something invisible was attacking him. We tried to help him, but it seemed that an invisible force kept him trapped. Finally, we managed to free him and continued running until we reached a clearer area. The feeling of danger diminished, but never completely disappeared. Upon returning to the barracks, we reported what had happened, but our superiors took it with skepticism. Since that day, everyone in the team changed. Alejandro left the army, unable to overcome the trauma. Alex rarely spoke and avoided the jungle at all costs. Raoul and I continued our military lives, but always with a sense of unease. We never returned to Los Haitises. What we experienced there remained etched in our minds, a reminder that there are places and forces in this world that we do not understand and that are better left alone. We had arrived at the camp at the beginning of May. The humidity and heat were suffocating, and the jungle seemed to be alive, breathing around us. We were a small group, 8 well-trained soldiers, but nothing prepared us for what we would find. The first night, while setting up the tents and establishing a secure perimeter, Javier, our scout, came running back from the forest. His face was pale and his eyes reflected a fear rarely seen in him. "You have to see this," he said, barely able to control his breathing. He led us through the underbrush to a clearing. What we saw there left us speechless. Dozens of rag dolls hung from the tree branches. They were rudimentary, made from scraps of cloth and stuffed with what seemed to be straw. Some were in better condition than others, but all had an eerie air about them. "Who could do something like this?" asked Sanchez, our gunner, breaking the silence. No one had an answer. The jungle seemed to keep its secrets, watching us in silence. We decided to leave the dolls where they were and return to the camp. That night, the usual jungle noises seemed more intense, as if they were watching us. The next morning, one of the dolls had appeared at the edge of our camp.
I recognized it immediately. It was the same doll I had seen the night before. Only now it was closer, as if it had covered the distance by itself.
"This doesn't make sense," murmured Martinez, our medic. "Who would do something like this?" The question remained unanswered. We decided to reinforce the night watches and stay alert. But every night, more dolls appeared, always getting a little closer. Then, one night, Ramos, one of our comrades, disappeared. We had finished a routine patrol and were about to rest when we noticed his absence. We searched everywhere, but there was no trace of him. The next day, one of the dolls had his face. It was grotesque and terrifying, as if someone had captured the essence of Ramos in that rag object.
"This can't be real," said Gomez, our commander. "We're being watched. I don't know who or what, but this isn't natural." The tension grew with each passing night. The dolls continued to appear, and the jungle became more oppressive. We began to notice shadows moving between the trees, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. One night, while on guard duty, I heard a strange noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I distinguished a whisper, as if someone were murmuring my name. I turned slowly and saw a figure in the darkness. It was tall and thin, almost humanoid, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "Who's there?" I shouted, pointing my weapon at the figure. There was no answer. The figure vanished into the darkness, leaving me with a cold that penetrated to my bones. I woke the others, but we found nothing. Only the dolls, which now seemed more numerous and closer than ever. Fear took hold of us. We decided we had to abandon the camp, but the jungle did not want to let us go. Every attempt to escape was thwarted by paths that closed up as if the trees and vegetation were alive and against us. One day, while trying to find a way out, we stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. Inside, we found old writings and drawings showing ancient rituals, sacrifices, and rag dolls. It was as if someone had been practicing dark magic in that place for years. "This is witchcraft," said Perez, our communication specialist. "We're trapped in some kind of curse." There was no way to escape that reality. Every night, the dolls kept appearing, always closer, always more threatening. Some of my comrades began to lose their sanity, speaking in whispers and seeing things that weren't there. One night, while a storm battered our camp, I heard a blood-curdling scream. I ran to the source of the sound and found Gomez, our commander, trapped on the ground, surrounded by dolls. I tried to help him, but something invisible held me back, a force that pushed me away. "Help me!" Gomez screamed, but his words were drowned out by the roar of the storm. The next day, Gomez had disappeared, and in his place was another doll with his pale face and empty eyes. We were no longer a team. We were a group of terrified and desperate men. We decided to burn the dolls, hoping that would break the curse. We gathered all we could find and threw them into the fire. The jungle seemed to roar in protest. The fire illuminated our faces, revealing the fear and despair in our eyes. But when the flames died down, the dolls were still there, intact. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder, and the dolls seemed to move in the darkness. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned, I saw the figure with glowing eyes. This time, it was closer, and I could see its face, an amalgam of all the faces of my missing comrades. "What do you want from us?" I shouted, but there was no answer. I woke the rest, but the figure had disappeared. I didn't know if I was losing my sanity or if I had really seen what I believed I had seen. We decided to make one last attempt to escape at dawn. We moved quickly, avoiding looking back. The jungle seemed to resist, but we managed to make our way out. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours, we found a path that led us out of the jungle. We were not the same men who had entered. We were shadows of what we once were, marked by an experience we could never forget. We never knew what really was in that jungle. The official reports mentioned disappearances and extreme conditions, but no one spoke of the dolls, the whispers, or the figure with glowing eyes. It was as if the entire experience had been a bad dream, but the scars were real, and the fear never disappeared. Since then, every time I close my eyes, I see those dolls and remember my lost comrades. The jungle may be behind,
but its horrors will follow me forever.
It was our third day of patrol in the area, searching for a group of guerrillas said to be operating in the region. So far, we had found no trace of them, just the oppressive silence of the jungle and the singing of insects. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the heat, it was something else, a premonition, a feeling that something wasn't right. I looked at my comrades, Sergeant Rodriguez and Corporal Sanchez, but they didn't seem to have noticed anything.
"Hey, have you felt anything?" I whispered to Rodriguez. He shook his head. "No, what's up?" "I don't know, it's like a bad feeling. I feel like something is going to happen." Rodriguez laughed. "You're paranoid, Ramirez. It's just the heat. Have some water." I took out my canteen and drank a sip of warm water. It didn't take away the feeling of unease, but I didn't want to worry my comrades. We continued walking in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream broke the silence of the jungle, a scream of pain, of terror. We stopped immediately, our hearts pounding in our chests. "What was that?" whispered Sanchez. "I don't know," responded Rodriguez with a tense voice. "Let's check it out." We drew our weapons and advanced cautiously in the direction of the scream. The vegetation was getting denser, and the sunlight barely penetrated through the leaves. We stumbled over roots and vines, and the air became increasingly suffocating. Suddenly we arrived at a clearing. In the center of the clearing lay the body of one of our men. He was lying on the ground, his face pale, and his eyes wide open. He had a deep wound in his chest from which blood gushed out. Another scream echoed in the jungle, this time closer. Rodriguez and Sanchez ran towards the sound, and I followed closely. We found the other soldier a few meters away. He was also dead, with a similar wound in his chest. Fear took hold of me. What was happening? Who had killed our comrades? We saw no one. We heard no sound. Only the oppressive silence of the jungle. Suddenly, a thick red mist began to rise from the ground, enveloping us completely. We couldn't see anything, just the intense red of the mist. The screams continued, getting closer and more desperate. I ran blindly, stumbling over roots and vines. I tried to escape the mist, the screams, the terror that consumed me. I don't know how long I ran, but finally, I fell to the ground, exhausted and terrified. When the mist dissipated, I found myself alone. My comrades had disappeared without a trace. Only the bloodstains on the ground remained, a macabre reminder of what had happened. I stood up, trembling and disoriented. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The jungle surrounded me, a green and hostile labyrinth. I felt like a cornered prey, waiting to be the next victim. I walked aimlessly, not knowing what to do. Fear consumed me, desperation took over. I just wanted to get out of that green hell, go home to my family. Suddenly, I saw a light in the distance, a dim, flickering light. I was filled with hope and ran towards it. The light got closer, and as I approached, I could distinguish the shape of a wooden cabin. I reached the cabin and knocked on the door. There was no response. I knocked again, this time more forcefully. The door slowly opened, and an old woman looked at me with kind eyes. "Come in, my child," she said in a soft voice. "You will be safe here." I entered the cabin, and the old woman closed the door behind me. I sat in a wooden chair, and she gave me a glass of fresh water. I drank slowly, savoring every drop. The old woman watched me in silence, with a compassionate expression on her face. "Tell me what happened to you, my child," she finally said. I told her everything that had happened, from the moment the red mist enveloped the jungle to the disappearance of my comrades. The old woman listened attentively, without interrupting me once. When I finished speaking, she remained silent for a long time. Then she looked at me with a sad expression. "What you have seen is an ancient curse," she said. "A curse that has haunted this jungle for centuries. It is said to feed on fear and despair, taking the unwary to a terrible fate." I was speechless. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A curse? A terrible fate? What can I do? I asked, my voice trembling. "You must be strong," the old woman replied. "You must overcome your fear and face the curse. Only then can you save yourself and return home." I didn't know how to do it, but I was determined to try. I couldn't allow the curse to take me as well. The old woman gave me a protection amulet and told me to follow the light of the moon. Then she bid me farewell with a hug and wished me luck. I left the cabin and ventured into the night. The moon shone brightly in the sky, illuminating the path through the jungle. I walked for hours, following the light of the moon and the old woman's words. Suddenly, I saw a red light in the distance. The light got closer, and as I approached, I could distinguish the shape of a human figure. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure turned around and looked at me with eyes as red as blood. It was one of my comrades, but he was not the same. His face was distorted by fear and anger, and his hands were covered in blood. "Join us!" he screamed. "Become one of us!" I lunged at him with the old woman's amulet in hand. The struggle was fierce, but I finally managed to defeat him. His body crumbled to the ground, leaving only a cloud of red mist. I stood, breathing heavily. I had survived, but I wasn't sure what the future held. The curse was still there, lurking in the jungle. I knew I couldn't stay forever. I had to return home to my family. But I didn't know how to do it. Suddenly, the light of the moon intensified, and a portal opened before me. It was my chance to escape. I ran towards the portal and went through it. In an instant, I found myself back home in my room. I lay down on my bed and closed my eyes. I couldn't believe it had all been real. Had it been just a nightmare? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. I would never forget the experience in the jungle. The red curse had marked me forever. The next day, I woke up with a sense of peace and tranquility. The nightmare had passed, and I was alive. I got out of bed and went to the window. I looked up at the blue sky and took a deep breath. I was alive, and I was home, and that was all that mattered. From the start, the army had taught me to face my fears and stay calm under pressure. However, nothing had prepared me for what I experienced that night. Sometimes I wonder if it was all a product of my exhausted mind, but the clarity of the details makes me doubt. This is the story of my encounter with the inexplicable during a night patrol in a remote forest in Eastern Europe. It was 2 a.m, and the air was thick with a fog that barely allowed us to see a few meters ahead. The moon, hidden behind dense clouds, left the landscape in an eerie twilight. My team, composed of 5 soldiers, had been sent to investigate suspicious movements reported by our local allies. We advanced cautiously, communicating in whispers and hand signals. "Sergeant, did you hear that?" whispered Corporal Martinez, stopping abruptly. I signaled for the team to halt and sharpened my ears. At first, I only heard the crunching of leaves under our feet and the soft murmur of the wind among the trees. But then a strange sound filtered through the fog, a sort of whispering chant, like an ancient melody. "Yes, I hear it," I replied. "Keep your eyes open and advance with caution." We headed towards the source of the sound, our steps resonating softly in the forest's tranquility. The closer we got, the clearer the melody became. It was hypnotic, but also chilling, as if the voices came from another world. Finally, we arrived at a clearing in the forest, and we saw it. A man dressed in an old military uniform stood in the center of the clearing. His clothes seemed straight out of World War I, a long coat, high boots, and a steel helmet. But the most disturbing thing was his face. A completely smooth, white surface, without features, as if someone had erased his features. "Who are you?" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative but with my voice trembling slightly. The man did not respond. He simply stood there motionless, staring at us with that eyeless face. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sergeant, this isn't normal," said Soldier Rivera, taking a step back. "This guy isn't from here." "Stay calm," I ordered, though I struggled to maintain composure myself. "We'll approach cautiously." I took a step forward and suddenly the man disappeared. There was no flash, no sound. He simply vanished into the air as if he had never been there. We stood frozen, stunned, unable to process what we had just witnessed. "What the hell was that?" exclaimed Corporal Martinez, breaking the silence. "I don't know, but we must move forward," I responded, trying to sound firm. "We have a mission to complete." We continued our patrol, but the atmosphere had become even tenser. Every shadow seemed to move, and the whisper of the wind turned into whispering voices in our minds. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached our objective, an abandoned cabin. The cabin was in ruins, but had clearly been used recently. We found traces of food and modern military equipment. However, the most unsettling thing was a series of black and white photos pasted on a wall. In all of them, the man without a face appeared, always in the same forest clearing, always in the same uniform. "This doesn't make sense," said Rivera, shining his flashlight over the photos. "How can he be in all these photos?" "We need to get out of here," said Martinez, his voice full of urgency. "This is a trap." Before I could respond, a blood-curdling scream echoed in the air, coming from the forest. We looked at each other, fear reflected in our eyes. "Retreat," I ordered. "We're heading back to the base now." We left the cabin and started running back the way we had come. But the fog seemed thicker, and the forest more confusing. The trees closed around us, and the clearing, where we had seen the man without a face, seemed impossible to find. "Over here!" shouted Rivera, pointing to a path we hadn't seen before. We followed it, hoping to find a way out. However, at the end of the path, we found ourselves back in the same clearing. The man without a face was there, motionless, watching us without eyes. "This is impossible," I whispered, feeling panic take over. Suddenly, the man began to move. He approached us slowly, his presence emanating a palpable sense of evil. We backed away, but the clearing seemed to close around us. The air turned icy, and the whisper of the ancient melody filled the space. "No!" shouted Martinez, raising his weapon. "Don't come any closer!" He fired, but the bullets passed through the man without causing harm. He seemed intangible, like a shadow. Finally, total darkness surrounded us, and the last thing I remember is the intense cold and the sound of the melody. I woke up in the military hospital along with the rest of my team. They had found us unconscious on the edge of the forest. No one could explain what had happened to us, and the photos we had found in the cabin had disappeared. Since then, I've tried to forget that night, but the images and sounds still haunt me. Sometimes, in the darkness of the night, I think I hear that ancient melody and wonder if the man without a face is still there, waiting in the forest clearing, ready to lure more unsuspecting souls into his realm of shadows. My platoon advanced cautiously, machetes in hand, cutting through the dense vegetation. We were a group of young soldiers, fresh out of the academy, sent on a reconnaissance mission in a remote border area. The order was simple: look for any signs of enemy activity. We had been walking for days, finding nothing but wild animals and ancient ruins. The group's morale began to drop. Fatigue and monotony took hold of us. Suddenly, one of the soldiers, young Martinez, stumbled upon something. He bent down to pick it up, and among the rotten leaves, he pulled out a small silver relic. It was a handcrafted piece adorned with strange symbols I had never seen before. Martinez, fascinated by the find, showed it to the rest of the platoon. We all examined it with curiosity, not knowing that this small object would bring a curse that would change our lives forever. We managed to complete the mission without incident, but Martinez kept the silver relic. Despite warnings from some, he refused to get rid of it. He said it brought him luck. Upon returning home, things began to change. Martinez, who had once been a cheerful and joking young man, became withdrawn and silent. He spent hours staring at the relic, murmuring words under his breath. One night we found him in his room, pale as a ghost, clutching the relic in his hand. His eyes were filled with terror. "I've seen it!" he screamed. "It's here! It won't leave me alone!" We didn't know what he was referring to, but his terror was palpable. The next day, Martinez disappeared without a trace. We searched everywhere but found not a single clue. The deaths began a year later. The first was Sergeant Rodriguez, found in his trench with his throat slit from ear to ear. The autopsy revealed no trace of the killer, only a strange spiral mark on his chest. Then it was Corporal Gomez, found hanged in the bathroom with the same spiral mark on his forehead. Panic gripped the platoon. We all knew that the curse of the relic was after us. I was the only one who still had it after I found it among Martinez's belongings. I kept it hidden in my backpack, hoping the curse wouldn't reach me. But it didn't work. One night, while I was sleeping, I woke up to a cold presence in the room. I saw a dark shadow next to my bed, with eyes glowing like embers. In an instant, the shadow attacked me. I fought with all my might, but it was too powerful. It took the relic from me and vanished into the night. The next day, I woke up with the spiral mark on my chest. I knew it was my turn. I had no time to lose. I had to find a way to break the curse before it killed me. I deserted the army and embarked on a desperate quest for answers. I traveled to remote places, consulted shamans and paranormal experts. Finally, in a remote village in the mountains, I found an old shaman who revealed the truth about the relic. It was a cursed object created by an indigenous tribe centuries ago to contain the spirit of a bloodthirsty warrior. The spirit could only be released if someone opened the relic, and could only be calmed by returning it to its place of origin, a sacred cave deep in the jungle. I returned to the jungle, following the shaman's instructions. The journey was long and dangerous, filled with traps and enemies. But I was determined to stop the curse, even if it meant my own death. Finally, I reached the cave. Inside, I found a stone altar where I was supposed to place the relic. As I did, the spirit of the warrior was released, filling the cave with a dark and terrifying energy. The spirit attacked me with fury, seeking revenge for its long imprisonment. I fought it with all my might, using the combat techniques I had learned in the army and the shaman's teachings. The battle was fierce, the spirit was powerful, but I was driven by desperation and the desire to end the curse. Finally, I managed to land a fatal blow, banishing it from this world forever. Exhausted and wounded, I left the cave and returned to civilization. The curse was broken, and I could finally live in peace. Despite having defeated the warrior's spirit, the scars of the experience marked me forever. I lost my friends, my military career, and a part of my innocence. However, I also gained something: the wisdom of having faced the darkness and the strength to keep going. I decided to dedicate my life to helping others who, like me, had been victims of the paranormal. I have traveled the world investigating cases of paranormal activity and helping those who have been tormented by evil spirits. It hasn't been easy, but I'm passionate about what I do. I know that darkness will always be present in the world, but I also know that there are people like me willing to face it and protect the innocent. The bloody relic remains a mystery to me. I don't know who created it or why it was abandoned in the jungle. But one thing is certain: I will never forget it. It is a constant reminder of the battle I fought and the lesson I learned. Darkness can be defeated, but it always leaves a mark. I have shared my story with you because I believe it is important for the world to know that darkness exists. We must not fear it, but we must be prepared to face it. If you ever encounter something paranormal, don't hesitate to seek help. There are people like me who can help you face your fears and protect you from the darkness. Remember, light always triumphs over darkness. If you are reading this, it is because my story has reached your hands. I am not a superstitious man, nor do I believe in the ghost stories told around campfires. I have served in the Mexican army for over 20 years and have seen things few could imagine. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened to us in the Chiapas jungle. I grew up in a small town in northern Mexico where life was hard and opportunities were scarce. From a young age, I knew the army was my way to escape poverty and give my family a better life. So, at 18, I enlisted and left everything I knew behind. The military discipline and the missions assigned to me shaped and hardened me, but also gave me a purpose. My team, which we called the Jaguars, was my second family. Each of us had our reasons for being there, but we all shared the same goal: to protect our country and our people.
We had faced drug traffickers, guerrillas, and all kinds of dangers in the jungle, but the mission we were assigned this time was different.
We were sent to investigate reports of unusual activities in a remote area of the jungle. Local inhabitants spoke of a path that had appeared out of nowhere, one that no one remembered seeing before. Some said it was cursed, that those who followed it never returned. But as soldiers, we could not be swayed by superstitions. On the first day of the mission, everything seemed normal. We ventured into the jungle, following the coordinates we had been given. The humidity and heat were suffocating, and the constant sound of insects and animals surrounded us. But we were all used to those conditions. What we didn't expect was what we would find at nightfall. As we set up camp, Corporal Cuevas, one of the youngest in the group, pointed at something among the trees. "Sergeant, look at that," he said, with a mix of curiosity and fear in his voice. There, in the middle of the darkness, was a narrow path barely visible in the light of our flashlights. "Does anyone remember seeing this on the map?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Everyone shook their heads. "It must be the path the locals talked about," commented Lieutenant Ruiz. "What do we do, Sergeant?" "We explore," I replied, trying to hide my own unease. "We divide into two groups and proceed with caution." We ventured into the path, advancing in silence and with heightened senses. The vegetation seemed denser and more oppressive as we moved forward, as if the jungle itself wanted to stop us. Along the way, we found signs that someone had recently passed through. Broken branches, footprints in the muddy ground, and strange symbols carved into the trees. "I don't like this," murmured Soldier Mario, a veteran who rarely showed fear. "Those symbols, they look ancient." "Focus on the mission," I responded, though deep down I shared his unease. After a few hours, the path led us to a clearing in the jungle. In the center was a stone altar covered in moss and vines. It looked like it had been there since time immemorial. We approached cautiously, examining the place. "There's nothing here," said Corporal Cuevas, but his voice sounded uncertain. "Maybe this altar has some clue," I suggested. "Cuevas, Ruiz, check the surroundings. Mario and I will stay here." While the others explored the clearing, I began to inspect the altar. As I touched it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was not right. Suddenly I heard a scream. I turned and saw Cuevas running toward us, his face pale with terror. "Sergeant, we have to go! Now!" "What happened?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Ruiz, he just disappeared. We were checking some bushes and suddenly, he was gone, like the jungle swallowed him." Without wasting time, I gathered the team and we decided to return to the camp. But the path we had come on was no longer there. It was as if the jungle had changed around us. We were trapped. "This doesn't make sense," I said, trying to stay calm. "We couldn't have deviated that much." "It's like the jungle is playing with us," murmured Mario. We spent the night in the clearing, taking turns to keep watch. No one could sleep well, and in the darkness, the sounds of the jungle seemed more sinister than ever. At dawn, we decided to continue exploring, hoping to find a way out. The second day only got worse. We found more symbols carved into the trees, and at one point, we heard a blood-curdling scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We moved faster, driven by a mix of fear and desperation. Then the unthinkable happened. Soldier Mario began to behave strangely. He murmured unintelligible things and looked around with wild eyes. "They're watching us," he repeated over and over. "They're hunting us." "Calm down, Mario," I said, trying to soothe him. "We'll find a way out." But Mario didn't listen. Suddenly, he ran into the jungle, screaming. We tried to follow him, but it was as if the jungle had swallowed him too. Now, there were only three of us: Cuevas, me, and the growing fear in our hearts. The third night was the worst. We had taken refuge in another clearing, exhausted and desperate. Cuevas and I whispered to each other, trying to stay awake. "Do you think there's something behind all this, Sergeant?" asked Cuevas, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it is, it's not natural." Suddenly, the air turned cold, and a figure emerged from the trees. It was tall, dark and had red eyes that glowed in the dark. I felt an indescribable terror, as if my soul was being ripped from my body. "Cuevas, run!" I shouted, but my words seemed to have no effect. The figure approached slowly, and each step it took made the ground shake. At that moment, I remembered the stories I had heard as a child about demons and evil spirits that inhabited the darkest corners of the earth. But this was not a story. It was real. "Leave us alone!" I shouted, pointing my rifle at the figure, but I knew bullets would be no use against something like this. "You have desecrated this place," said a deep, resonant voice. "You have followed the forbidden path, and now you must face the consequences." Cuevas fell to the ground unconscious. I felt a sharp pain in my head, as if something was trying to penetrate my mind. But I couldn't give up, not after everything we had been through. "What do you want from us?" I asked, trying to stay firm. "Your soul," the demon replied, and its smile revealed a row of teeth as sharp as blades. The only option we had left was to fight, not with our weapons, but with our will. I remembered the words of an old shaman I had met years ago during a mission in the south. He said that demons could only be defeated by those who faced their own fears. I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate. I had to face my own fears, my own inner demons. I remembered my childhood, the difficult moments, and the decisions I had made. I remembered my family, my fallen comrades, and those who depended on me. The pain in my head began to diminish, and when I opened my eyes, the demon seemed less intimidating. "I am not afraid of you," I said firmly. The figure took a step back, and I could feel its surprise. "What are you doing?" it asked, its voice filled with fury. "Facing you," I responded. "I am not afraid of you. You cannot control us." The demon let out a deafening roar, but its power seemed to wane. Beside me, Cuevas began to move, waking from his unconsciousness. Together, we advanced toward the figure, which slowly faded away. "It cannot be," murmured the demon. "You cannot defeat me." "We already did," I said, and with a final scream, the figure disappeared, leaving behind an eerie silence. It took us hours to find our way back to civilization, but we did it. When we finally emerged from the jungle, we were changed men. We had faced something beyond comprehension and survived. Upon arriving at the base, we reported our experience, but few believed us. However, for us, there was no doubt about what we had faced. The devil's path was real, and those who ventured into it faced trials that tested their souls. I decided to leave the army shortly after that mission. I returned to my hometown, seeking the peace I had lost in the jungle. But the memory of that path and the demon we faced will never leave me. If you ever find yourself in the Chiapas jungle and see a path that shouldn't be there, remember my story. Do not follow the devil's path. Because once you enter, you never know if you will be able to leave. My name is Roberto, but in the squad, everyone calls me El Gato because of my ability to come out unscathed from situations that would be fatal for anyone else. I was born in a small town in the state of Veracruz, where life didn't offer many opportunities. Since childhood, I have always been restless and adventurous, which worried my parents but also prepared me for military life. At 18, I enlisted in the army seeking an escape, a purpose. I never imagined that I would find much more than that. Loyal friends, constant challenges, and above all, a destiny that would take me to the edge of reason and sanity. It was a moonless night, the kind of darkness that makes it difficult to distinguish between reality and imagination. Our mission was simple in theory: patrol a forested area near a small town in Chiapas where unusual activities had been reported. The locals spoke of strange lights and eerie sounds at night, but for us seasoned soldiers, it was just another day at the office. "Jimenez, make sure everyone is ready in 5 minutes," ordered Sergeant Reyes, a stern man with not a hint of humor. "Yes, Sergeant," I replied as I made sure the team was in order. The squad was composed of 6 men, each with a unique skill. We had known each other for years and had been through a lot together, but nothing had prepared us for what we were about to face. We ventured into the forest in formation, advancing cautiously. As we progressed, the vegetation became denser and the feeling of being watched intensified. After an hour of marching, we reached a clearing. What we saw there chilled us to the bone. There were makeshift crosses made of branches, lined up in uneven rows. They didn't look like formal graves, but rather a desperate attempt to mark the place where the dead rested. A sepulchral silence enveloped us, and the temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees. "What the hell is this?" murmured Rodriguez, one of the youngest in the group. "It looks like an improvised cemetery," said Morales, our communications expert, eyeing the crosses with distrust. We approached cautiously, and that's when the hallucinations began. First, it was Gutierrez who said he heard whispers coming from the ground. "I hear voices," he exclaimed, his eyes wide open. "Stop joking, Gutierrez," I responded, trying to stay calm, but deep down, I felt a growing unease. However, it didn't take long before we all started experiencing the same thing. The voices were soft, barely whispers, but unmistakable. They seemed to call our names, pleading for help, or perhaps seeking revenge. "What's happening, Sergeant?" asked Mario, visibly upset. "Stay calm and don't split up," ordered Reyes, though his voice betrayed an unusual nervousness. The voices weren't the only thing. Soon after, the visions began. I saw a man, clearly a soldier, with a torn uniform and a pale face standing next to one of the crosses. His eyes were empty pits of despair. "Who are you?" I asked, though I didn't expect an answer. "We died here," said the man in a hollow voice. "They abandoned us, and now we are trapped." "What do you mean?" I asked, but the figure vanished before I could get a response. The others also began to see the dead. Rodriguez screamed when he saw a woman with a baby in her arms, both with looks of anguish. Morales fell to his knees, crying as he tried to ward off the visions of small children playing among the crosses. Reyes decided it was time to move, but the clearing seemed to have us trapped. Every time we tried to leave, something stopped us. It was as if the forest was closing around us, preventing us from finding our way back. "We're trapped in this damn place," said Mario, the desperation in his voice evident. That's when we found a small cabin at the edge of the clearing. Inside, we discovered an old, handwritten diary. It belonged to a man named Alejandro, who had been part of a squad sent to the same area years ago. "The souls of the dead have trapped us," said one of the last entries. "The crosses are their graves. They are condemned to wander here forever, and anyone who comes too close will share their fate." The diary entries revealed a chilling truth. Alejandro's squad had been ambushed by a rebel group, and not receiving help, they died in the clearing. Their souls were left trapped, seeking vengeance, or perhaps simply company in their eternal solitude. "We have to get out of here before it's too late," said Reyes, closing the diary forcefully. But the crosses seemed to come alive. The voices grew louder, the dead more visible. It seemed that every step we took was watched by those who rested beneath the crosses. With hearts pounding, we decided to make one last attempt to escape. We formed a line and advanced together, ignoring the voices and visions surrounding us. "Don't stop!" shouted Reyes. "Keep moving!" The branches seemed to grab at us as if the forest itself was trying to stop us, but we didn't give up. After what felt like hours of struggle, we finally saw the moonlight through the trees. We had managed to leave the clearing. Back at the base, we tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed us. They said we had been victims of stress and fatigue, that our minds had played tricks on us in the darkness of the forest. But we knew the truth. Sometimes in my dreams, I still hear those voices. I feel that the dead in the clearing still call out to me, waiting for me to return someday. But I have learned to live with it, knowing that as long as I stay away from those crosses, my soul will be safe. Life goes on, and I, Roberto El Gato Jimenez, move forward with the certainty that in some dark corner of the world, the lost souls continue to seek their eternal rest. It all began when our squad of 8 soldiers received orders to patrol a remote region in the Chiapas jungle. There were rumors of drug traffickers' activities, and we needed to ensure the area was free of threats. Our mission seemed straightforward: explore, report, and return to base. But from the moment we arrived, things began to go awry. One afternoon, while exploring a particularly dense section of the jungle, one of my comrades, Corporal Morales, discovered a cave hidden among the vegetation. The entrance was partially covered by vines and branches, but what truly caught our attention was the large number of human skulls decorating the entrance, as if someone had placed those macabre relics there, on purpose to warn us of what lay inside. "Javier, do you see what I see?" Morales asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Yes, Morales, this doesn't look good at all," I replied, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Despite our reservations, we decided to enter. It was our responsibility to ensure there were no hidden dangers in that place. When we turned on our flashlights, the light revealed more skulls piled along the cave walls. Their empty sockets seemed to watch us with an eternal, lifeless gaze. The atmosphere became suffocating, and the air was heavy with a smell of dampness and decay. As we advanced, we started to hear whispers. At first, we thought it was the wind filtering through the cave's cracks, but soon it became clear that the sounds were not natural. The voices seemed to call our names, whispering in an unknown language that made our skin crawl. "You heard that, right?" asked Sergeant Ramirez, his face pale and sweaty. "Yes, but stay calm," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I really was. We continued our advance until we reached a larger chamber. In the center was a rudimentary altar made of stone, and on it, a larger skull decorated with symbols we didn't recognize. As we approached, the voices intensified, and the shadows began to move along the walls as if they were alive. "We need to get out of here! This isn't normal," said Soldier Gomez, backing toward the entrance. Before we could react, one of the shadows slid toward him and enveloped him. Gomez began to scream and convulse. His eyes turned white, and his body fell to the ground motionless. We tried to help him, but it was as if an invisible force repelled us. "Let's get out of here now," shouted Morales, and we all started running toward the exit. Back at the camp, we tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed us. Our superiors thought we had been victims of stress and fatigue, and that Gomez had suffered an epileptic seizure. But we knew the truth. From that day, the shadows and whispers began to follow us, even outside the cave. Each night, our tents were invaded by the same voices we heard in the cave. We woke up sweating, feeling watched. Several of my comrades began to fall ill, experiencing high fever and hallucinations. Sergeant Ramirez was the first to disappear. One night, he simply wasn't in his tent, and we couldn't find any trace of him anywhere. "This is killing us one by one, Javier," said Morales, his face gaunt and eyes sunken. "We need to find a way to stop this," I replied, feeling the desperation grow inside me. I remembered my grandmother's stories about spirits and how they sometimes sought revenge for disturbances in their sacred places. We decided to return to the cave, believing that perhaps there was a way to appease the entities that were haunting us. It was a desperate decision, but we had no other choice. Back in the cave, the atmosphere was even heavier than the first time. We approached the altar and, with fear, began to bury the skulls we found on its surface. We prayed, asking for forgiveness for our intrusion and begging for mercy. We didn't know if our words would be heard, but at that moment, it was our only hope. The shadows and whispers seemed to calm down as we worked. We felt a strange peace fill the cave, and for a moment, we believed it was over. But as we left, we realized someone was missing. Morales wasn't with us. "Morales!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the jungle's silence. There was no response. I returned to the cave, hoping to find him, but it was empty. His disappearance was a devastating blow. We knew the spirits had claimed another victim, and though the rest of us managed to return to the camp without further incident, the void left by our lost comrades was impossible to fill. The following days were a test of endurance. The shadows and whispers diminished but did not disappear completely. They remained, haunting us, reminding us that we had disturbed something ancient and powerful. The illness and fear wore us down, and one by one my comrades succumbed, either to the fever or the inexplicable accidents that began to occur. In the end, I was left alone,
Guilt and despair consumed me, but I knew I had to continue, not for myself, but for the memory of my comrades. I left the army soon after, unable to face the reality of what I had lived through. I returned to Veracruz, hoping to find solace in the memories of my childhood and my grandmother's stories. But the shadows followed me. Sometimes, in the dark of night, I still hear their whispers, calling me by my name, reminding me that there are things in this world that should not be disturbed. And every time I see a skull, I remember the cave and the men I lost, and I realize that some fates cannot be avoided. The jungle has its secrets, and those who dare to unearth them must be prepared to face the consequences. This is my story, and I tell it not to scare, but to warn. Because sometimes, legends and myths are more real than we are willing to believe. Our squad was assigned a reconnaissance mission in the southern Mexican jungle. There were rumors of armed groups' activity, and our job was to confirm and report. It was an inhospitable area, far from any trace of civilization, where nature was dense and hostile. We had been walking through the jungle for 3 days without finding anything out of the ordinary. The humidity was suffocating, and the insects wouldn't leave us alone. Morale was low, but we kept going. One night, while keeping watch around the camp, we heard a whisper. At first we thought it was the wind playing among the branches, but the sound became clearer. It was a female voice, soft and distressed. "Help! Please help me!" The voice came from somewhere in the darkness. We looked at each other incredulously. What was a woman doing in the middle of the jungle at this hour? The lieutenant ordered us to prepare and cautiously advance toward the source of the call. With flashlights on and weapons ready, we ventured deeper into the thicket. It didn't take long to find her. She was a young woman with torn clothes and a disheveled appearance. Her eyes were full of fear and despair. "Who are you? And what are you doing here?" Lieutenant Ramirez asked firmly. "My name is Maria," she replied between sobs. "I got lost looking for my family. I need help." The woman seemed genuinely terrified, and we couldn't leave her alone in the jungle. We decided to take her back to the camp so she could rest and tell her story more calmly. Back at the camp, we gave her water and some food. Maria told us she had been looking for her family, who had disappeared in the jungle several days ago. She said they lived in a small settlement further in, but one night everyone disappeared without a trace. I searched for days, but couldn't find them. "Please help me find them," she begged us. Lieutenant Ramirez, though skeptical, decided that at dawn we would investigate the settlement. We needed to make sure it wasn't a trap. The next morning, we woke up to find that Maria had disappeared. There was no trace of her, as if she had never been there. "I don't like this at all," said El Negro Morales. "Something weird is going on here." Despite Maria's strange disappearance, we continued with the plan to investigate the settlement. After several hours of walking, we finally arrived. What we found left us chilled. The huts were in ruins, as if they had been abandoned long ago. There were no signs of life, just an eerie silence that gave us goosebumps. "This doesn't make sense," murmured La Rata Jimenez. "Where is Maria's family?" While exploring the place, El Lobo Cuevas found a half-buried diary. He opened it and began to read aloud. "Today, my husband and children disappeared. Something in this jungle took them. I'm scared. If someone finds this diary, please help me find my family. Maria." We stood in silence, processing the information. Maria's story was real, but something terrible had happened to her family. That night, we kept watch again, nervous and alert. Suddenly, the same distressed voice of Maria echoed in the darkness. "Help! Please help me!" We ran toward the sound, and there she was, just like the previous night. She seemed not to remember having seen us before. "Maria, it's us! We helped you last night!" I shouted, trying to make her come to her senses. But she only repeated the same plea, as if trapped in an eternal loop of despair. Lieutenant Ramirez stepped forward and tried to touch her, but his hand passed through her as if she was smoke. At that moment, we understood the terrible truth. "She's a spirit," said El Gordo.
Mario with a trembling voice. She's trapped here, looking for her family. Panic took hold of us. We were facing something beyond our understanding, something we couldn't fight with weapons. We decided to abandon the settlement and return to the base, hoping to escape Maria's presence. But the jungle seemed unwilling to let us go. We walked in circles, unable to find our way back. Maria's voice followed us, increasingly desperate. "Help! Please help me!" Finally, exhausted and desperate, we found a clearing in the jungle where we decided to spend the night. During the watch, El Flaco Rodriguez began talking to himself as if someone were responding. "What are you doing?" I asked, worried. "She's telling me where to find her family," he replied, his eyes glazed. Before I could stop him, El Flaco ventured into the jungle. We followed, but soon lost sight of him. His voice faded into the distance. At dawn, we found El Flaco unconscious on the ground, murmuring incoherently. When he woke up, he didn't remember anything that had happened. "We have to get out of here," said Lieutenant Ramirez determinedly. "This isn't something we can handle." We managed to find our way back to the base after several days of forced march. We reported what had happened, but few believed us. The jungle kept its own secrets, and Maria, the woman of the jungle, continued to search for her family, trapped in an eternal torment. Every night when I close my eyes, I hear her voice. "Help, please help me." And I know that as long as she doesn't find peace, neither will we. Late in the summer, our squad was assigned a reconnaissance mission in a remote area of the Mexican jungle near the Guatemalan border. The objective was clear: investigate the disappearance of a scientific expedition that had vanished without a trace over 3 decades ago. We ventured into the jungle, following the trail of what was once Professor Emilio Salazar's expedition, a renowned archaeologist from the National University. There was something unsettling in the air. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the crunching of leaves under our feet. "This place gives me the creeps," said Corporal Rios, a robust and always skeptical man. "Relax, Rios. We're just here to do a job," I replied, trying to keep the group calm. As we advanced, the vegetation became denser and the darkness seemed to swallow us. Finally, we arrived at what appeared to be the remains of the expedition's camp. The tents were torn and covered in moss, as if the jungle itself had tried to erase any evidence of human presence. We explored the area for clues. It was Sergeant Ramirez who found the first sign of something strange, a diary, soaked and covered in mold. "Look at this, guys," said Ramirez, holding the diary as if it were a treasure. We gathered around him as he began to read aloud. June 21st, 1990. Something is following us. It's not an animal. I'm sure of that. The shadows move when we're not looking. Last night, one of the men disappeared without a trace. We're scared. The diary detailed how the expedition had begun to experience inexplicable phenomena. Shadows that seemed to have a life of their own, whispers in the night, and the disappearance of team members. As Ramirez read, a chill ran down my spine. I could feel something watching us from the jungle's darkness. "This is crazy," murmured Soldier Garcia. "There's no way this is real." But as the days passed, we began to experience things that defied all logic. Shadows moved in the corners of our eyes, and strange sounds echoed in the night. One night, while keeping watch, we heard a blood-curdling scream. We ran toward the sound, only to find that Corporal Rios had disappeared, leaving only his weapon and helmet on the ground. There were no signs of struggle, just an eerie silence. "What the hell is going on here?" shouted Ramirez, the desperation evident in his voice. We decided to stay together and remain alert, but the fear had already taken hold of our hearts. The next day, we found another diary buried under a pile of leaves. This one belonged to one of Professor Salazar's assistants. July 5th, 1990. We found a cave that isn't on the maps. Emilio thinks it's an important discovery, but I have my doubts. There's something in that cave, something that shouldn't be disturbed. We knew we had to find that cave to uncover the truth. Equipped with flashlights and weapons, we ventured into the jungle, following the diary's descriptions. After hours of searching, we found the entrance hidden among the vegetation. Inside, the air was cold and damp, The cave walls were covered in ancient inscriptions none of us could understand. We advanced cautiously until we reached an open chamber. There in the center was an ancient altar with ritual objects. Suddenly, Ramirez's flashlight began to flicker. A chilling whisper echoed through the cave. "We're not alone," I said, trying to control the tremor in my voice. The shadows around the altar began to move, taking shapes that were not entirely human. I felt a primal panic, a need to flee, but my legs wouldn't respond. "We need to get out of here," shouted Garcia. "Now!" Suddenly, the cave seemed to come alive. The shadows lunged at us. I fired, but the bullets passed through the figures without causing any harm. We ran toward the exit, abandoning any pretense of bravery. Once outside, we realized not all of us had made it out. Ramirez was missing, and there was no time to search for him. Terror drove us to keep running until we reached a safer area. That night, we huddled in a circle, trembling with fear. We didn't know if Ramirez was alive or dead, but we knew something ancient and malevolent was hunting us. While resting, Garcia found one last diary, belonging to Professor Salazar himself. July 12th, 1990. I made a grave mistake. The cave wasn't an archaeological find, but a sacred site, a resting place for entities that shouldn't be disturbed. Now we've unleashed their wrath, and I don't know if we'll escape alive. The professor's words resonated with an inescapable truth. We had awakened something that didn't belong to this world, and now we were paying the price. The following nights were hell. The men started disappearing one by one without a trace. Every time we tried to move, the shadows followed us, whispering promises of death and madness. On the last day, only Garcia and I remained. Exhausted and on the brink of despair, we decided to make one last trek to a clearing we had seen on the map. We hoped that daylight might offer us some protection. When we reached the clearing, we found an ancient pyramid covered in vegetation. We climbed to the top, where we found a small structure. Inside were inscriptions that seemed to be a warning or a spell. "What do we do now, Tigre?" asked Garcia, his eyes filled with fear and desperation. "I don't know," I replied, feeling the weight of uncertainty. "Maybe this is where we make our last stand." But before we could decide our next move, the shadows reached us. This time there was no escape. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and suddenly everything went dark. I woke up in a military hospital, not remembering how I got there. They told me I had been found unconscious in the jungle, but there was no trace of Garcia or the rest of my team. Now, as I write this, I can still hear the whispers in the darkness. I know something follows me, something that won't leave me alone until it finds what it seeks. Since that day, the Mexican jungle is a place I avoid at all costs. The memories of what we found there still haunt me, and the nights are especially hard. The doctors say it's post-traumatic stress, but I know the truth. Something ancient and malevolent was awakened, and although I escaped with my life, I'm not sure how much longer I can stay safe. Sometimes in the dark of night I can see the shadows moving in the corner of my eye, and the whispers return, reminding me that the horror is not over. We were to secure the perimeter of a ravine known for its natural dangers. The Barranco de las Almas Perdidas, as the locals called it, a name I had always dismissed as mere superstition. They warned us about the mysterious falls that had claimed the lives of several soldiers in the past, but those warnings did not deter us. "This is just another mission, right, Captain?" said Sanchez, one of my youngest men, trying to hide his nervousness. "Exactly, Sanchez. Just another mission," I replied, concealing my own doubts. The first day passed without incident. We set up our camp and began our patrols. It was during the first night that something strange happened. I was on guard with Lopez, a veteran who had seen more than any man should in a lifetime. "Did you hear that?" Lopez asked, peering into the darkness. "No, what was it?" "It sounded like a voice." I stayed silent,
trying to catch any sound. Then I heard it, a faint murmur, as if someone were whispering our names.
"It must be the wind," I said, though I was not so sure. However, the voices persisted, and soon we were not the only ones hearing them. The next day, several men reported hearing the same thing. The second night was even more unsettling. This time, while patrolling, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A few meters ahead of us, a dark figure briefly appeared among the trees. It looked like a soldier, but not one of ours. "Did you see that?" asked Ramirez, my second in command, his eyes wide open. "Yes," I replied, unsure of what else to say. We approached cautiously, but the figure had disappeared. On inspecting the area, we found nothing. However, the feeling of being watched did not leave us. On the third day, we decided to advance into the heart of the ravine, hoping to find a rational explanation for the strange occurrences. As we descended, the voices grew louder and clearer. We could hear screams of pain and whispers calling our names. "Captain, something is very wrong here," exclaimed Hernandez, one of the bravest soldiers in the unit.
"Stay calm, Hernandez. We'll get out of this together," I assured him, though I wasn't sure how. Suddenly, Sanchez, who was ahead, screamed and fell to the ground, writhing as if something invisible were attacking him. "Help! They're grabbing me!" he shouted, his eyes wide with terror.
We rushed to him trying to free him, but there was nothing to see, nothing to touch. We could only feel a cold presence, a force we could not fight. We managed to drag Sanchez out of the ravine, but he was in shock. As we tried to stabilize him, we heard a sound that chilled our blood, the echo of our own voices screaming for help from the bottom of the ravine. "This can't be happening," murmured Ramirez, his face pale. It was then I understood. The souls of the soldiers who had fallen in the ravine were trapped there, reliving their final moments of agony. And now they were calling us, wanting us to share their fate. "We need to get out of here right now," I ordered, trying to keep my composure. We started to retreat, but the terrain seemed to become more treacherous with every step. The voices became deafening, and spectral figures appeared everywhere, trying to stop us. "Don't stop!" I shouted, seeing Lopez lagging behind. "I can't! They're dragging me!" he responded, struggling against something invisible. I ran towards him, but before I could reach him, I saw him disappear into the darkness, his screams fading into a deadly silence. With the first light of dawn, the voices and apparitions began to fade. We found ourselves safe, though severely affected by what had happened. We lost Lopez and 2 other men that night. Their bodies never recovered. We returned to base with more questions than answers. No one believed us when we told our story, attributing it to some kind of collective psychosis. But we knew the truth. The ravine remains there, a reminder that there are things in this world that cannot be explained. Some of my men never fully recovered from that experience, and I still dream of the voices and figures that haunted us that night. Every time I pass near a ravine, I can't help but remember what happened. Sometimes I think I hear whispers calling me, as if those lost souls still haven't finished with me. But no matter what happens, I know I will never return to that cursed place. Because there are fates worse than death, and the Barranco de las Almas Perdidas is a witness to that. The cold mountain wind cut our faces as we advanced through the narrow pass called El Paso del Terror by the locals. I remember that mission clearly. It was the year 1998, and our unit had been sent to patrol that remote region due to reports of insurgent activity. However, what we found there was much worse than any human enemy. "Keep formation and move carefully," ordered Captain Morales, his firm voice trying to conceal the nervousness we all felt. The Pass of Terror was infamous for the ambushes that had occurred there during the Civil War. Soldiers and guerrillas alike had met their end on those cliffs and treacherous paths. The tales spoke of shadows and whispers at night, but we were men of science and training, not superstition. The first night in the pass was strangely quiet. We set up our camp in a small clearing protected by tall rocks. As darkness settled, we gathered around an improvised bonfire. The crackling fire and the warmth were comforting in the midst of the night's cold. "Has anyone heard the stories of this place?" asked Sergeant Ramirez, breaking the silence. Some men nodded. Others remained silent, but we all listened as Ramirez continued. They say the souls of the fallen soldiers still roam here, seeking revenge. They found no peace in death, so now they wander these paths. The stories were not new to me. I had heard them many times, but that night I felt something different in the air, a feeling of being watched, that we were not alone. I let my thoughts wander, attributing it to fatigue and the long hours of marching. Later that night, while on guard, I heard the first whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my mind, but the whispers became clearer, almost like voices trying to communicate. I turned my flashlight towards the edge of the camp, searching for anything that could be causing those sounds. I saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched intensified.
"Everything okay, Lieutenant?" asked Private Gomez, who had come to relieve me. "Yes, just the wind," I lied, not wanting to worry the men. The next morning, we advanced deeper into the pass. The terrain became more difficult, the rocks sharper, and the paths narrower. As the day went on, we began to find strange things: old bayonets, rusted helmets, and torn uniforms. They were the remains of those who had fallen here decades ago. "I don't like this," murmured Private Perez, looking at a helmet with a bullet hole in the center. "Focus," said Captain Morales. "Our mission is to secure this pass and prevent any insurgent activity." The second night was worse than the first. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was moving near my tent. I went out with my weapon ready but saw nothing. However, the whispers continued, now clearly forming words I couldn't understand. "Lieutenant, did you hear that?" asked Private Torres, approaching with a terrified expression on his face. "Yes, but there's nothing here. We need to stay calm," I replied, though I was terrified myself. That night, several of us saw the shadows. At first, they were barely perceptible, but then they became clearer, human figures moving among the trees and rocks, always out of reach of our flashlights. "Damn it, there's something out there," shouted Sergeant Ramirez, firing his weapon at one of the shadows. The sound of the shots echoed in the pass, but when the light from our flashlights reached the spot, there was nothing there. Only the echo of our shots and the whispers that now seemed to mock us. By the third day, morale was at rock bottom. The men spoke in whispers, afraid of attracting the attention of whatever was stalking us. We decided it was best to retreat and leave that damned pass. The last night, the whispers turned into screams. We woke up in the midst of a storm of voices, each telling a story of betrayal, fear, and death. It was as if the ghosts of those fallen soldiers were reliving their final moments. I saw shadows fighting each other, falling to the ground in agony, and others just watching with empty eyes. "They're attacking us!" shouted Private Gomez, firing his weapon aimlessly. "Stay calm!" ordered Captain Morales, though his own voice trembled. We tried to defend ourselves, but how do you fight against shadows and whispers? It was a losing battle from the start. Finally, we managed to leave the pass at dawn. Exhausted and terrified, we looked back only to see the shadows fade with the light of the sun. The official mission report mentioned nothing of what really happened. We said we had found signs of insurgent activity and decided to withdraw to avoid unnecessary casualties. But the men who were there know the truth. The Pass of Terror is not just a legend. Something dark and vengeful resides in those cliffs, something that still feels the pain and anger of the men who died there. I never return to that place, and every time the wind blows strong at night, I can hear the whispers, reminding me of that mission and the horrors we faced. We had received orders to explore an old military prison located in a remote and mountainous area. Our mission was simple: document and secure the site before its scheduled demolition. No one expected to find anything out of the ordinary. However, as night fell, we discovered that the prison's history was more sinister than we had imagined. The prison stood imposing, a gray stone colossus in the middle of nowhere. The structure, though weathered by time, retained a menacing air. Upon entering, the creaking of the rusty doors echoed like a lament. We set up in what appeared to be the guard room and began our inspection. While exploring the cells, I found a diary buried under a pile of rubble,
The leather was worn and the pages yellowed. Diary of Prisoner #101 read the first page. What followed was a disturbing account of torture and suffering. March 23rd, 1942. Today, I heard whispers again. No one believes me. They say I'm crazy. But I know there is something else here. I read the words with a chill running down my spine. As I continued through the pages, the prisoner's despair became more palpable. April 15th, 1942. I can't take it anymore. They wake me every night. The knocks, the screams, but no one is here. They are invisible. They are demons. That night, I shared my findings with the team. It's just another lunatic, said Jim, our leader, trying to downplay it. We can't ignore this. There's something strange in this place, replied Tom, the most superstitious of us. We decided to stay alert and continue with the mission. As night fell, the atmosphere in the prison changed. The air became dense and heavy. We gathered in the guard room where we had placed our sleeping bags. At midnight, the noises began. Thumping sounds and unintelligible whispers. We all woke up at the same time. Did you hear that? I asked, trying to stay calm. Yes, it's coming from the hallway, replied Tom, his face pale. We got up, flashlights in hand, and followed the sound. We reached a cell where the diary indicated prisoner 101 had been. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream broke the silence. We looked at each other terrified. This can't be real, muttered Jim, visibly scared. As the days passed, the phenomena worsened. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and the whispers turned into screams that chilled us to the bone. One of the most terrifying encounters was Tom's. I was in the kitchen looking for some food. I felt an intense cold behind me, and when I turned, I saw a blurry figure. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then the figure disappeared. The diary seemed to come to life. Every event narrated by the prisoner was repeating itself with us. We gathered to discuss our next move. This is affecting our mental health, said Jim. We need to get out of here. But we have to complete the mission, I insisted, though I was scared myself. I'd rather face a court-martial than these things, Tom replied. We finally decided to retreat at dawn. That last night was the worst. We struggled to sleep, but exhaustion eventually overcame us. Around 3 a.m, a loud noise woke us. The guard room was shrouded in darkness, and only our flashlights provided some security. Jim was the first to speak. Is everyone okay? Yes, but something is wrong here, replied Tom, visibly trembling. The diary lay open on the floor. The pages moved on their own, as if an invisible hand were flipping through them. We cautiously approached. A phrase written in fresh blood made us step back. You will not escape. Suddenly, we felt a presence behind us. A cold breath brushed our necks, and the whispers turned into deafening screams. Running and stumbling, we tried to get out of the prison. The doors slammed shut and opened violently, blocking our way. Finally, we managed to escape just as the sun began to rise on the horizon. Upon reaching the base camp, we reported our experience. No one believed us at first, but the marks on our skin and the pallor of our faces told a different story. The mission was officially aborted, and the prison was sealed forever. I never saw my comrades again. Each one went their separate ways, trying to forget what had happened. But I can't. Every night the whispers return. I know they're there, waiting. The story I'm about to share happened at a temporary military camp in a remote and forgotten region. Though it's difficult to talk about, I feel compelled to recount what we lived through, for it might serve as a warning to others. It was a night like any other when it all began. We had set up camp in a forest clearing, far from any civilization. The mission was simple: secure the area and prepare the ground for future operations. But the simplicity of our task quickly dissolved into indescribable dread. It all started with Corporal Martinez, a robust and always jovial guy I had known for years. One morning, he woke up pale with deep circles under his eyes. It seemed like he hadn't slept in days. "What's wrong, Martinez?" I asked as we prepared for the daily routine. "Last night,"
he said in a whisper, as if afraid someone else might hear us. "Last night I saw something." "Something?" I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "A nightmare?" "No, it was real. I saw a figure in my tent. It was tall, thin, and covered in shadows. It whispered things to me in a language I didn't understand. Then I felt a sharp pain in my chest, and everything went black." I didn't give it much importance at that moment, thinking he had just had a bad dream. But that same night, another soldier, Sergeant Ramirez, reported seeing the same thing, a dark figure whispering before disappearing. By then, I started to feel an increasing unease. Something was not right. By the third day, the entire camp was on high alert. Soldiers began falling ill one after another. The symptoms were always the same: high fever, extreme weakness, and delirium. And always, they mentioned the dark figures whispering in their ears before falling ill. Lieutenant Suarez, our commanding officer, tried to maintain calm and discipline, but even he could not hide his concern. One night, as we discussed the situation in his tent, I noticed his hand trembling slightly. "This can't be a coincidence," he said, running a hand through his gray hair. "There's something in this place, something affecting the men." "We need to evacuate, Lieutenant," I suggested. "This is out of our control." But evacuation was not an easy option. We were on a crucial mission, and the High Command would not understand a retreat without a concrete reason. A week later, the situation had become untenable. Most of the men were incapacitated, and those who remained standing were on the verge of collapse from exhaustion and fear. I myself began to feel the first signs of the illness: fever, chills, and worst of all, those whispers in the night. One night, as I tried to sleep, I felt a presence in my tent. I opened my eyes, and there it was, a dark, blurry figure. Its words were unintelligible but filled with malice. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something was trying to tear out my soul. Then everything went black. I woke up at dawn, drenched in sweat, and with a sense of terror I had never experienced before. I knew we didn't have much time. If we didn't do something soon, we would all die. Finally, Lieutenant Suarez made a drastic decision. He contacted the High Command and explained the situation. I don't know what he told them exactly, but the next morning we received the order to evacuate the camp. As we retreated, the whispers intensified. I could feel the dark figures following us, stalking us. It was a chaotic withdrawal, with the sick men being carried on improvised stretchers and the others covering our advance, fearful of what might come from the darkness of the forest. Upon reaching the extraction point, the tension eased a bit, but the fear did not disappear. The helicopters took us to a safer base, where we finally received proper medical treatment. The illness began to subside, but the psychological scars remained. Today, years later, I still have nightmares about those whispers and the dark figures. Some of my comrades never fully recovered, and others simply couldn't overcome the experience. The official reports never mentioned anything about the dark figures. They only referred to an unknown illness that affected the unit. But those of us who were there know the truth. Something ancient and evil inhabited that forest and toyed with our minds and bodies as if we were mere puppets. The experience left me with a clear lesson. There are things in this world that we cannot understand or fight with our weapons and training. And sometimes all we can do is survive and live to tell the tale, hoping that others do not suffer the same fate. We were advancing through an area that had been an intense battlefield just days before. Remnants of weapons, shells, and abandoned trenches adorned the landscape as a grim reminder of death. The sun was setting, and the elongated shadows of the trees whispered stories none of us wanted to hear. On a small elevation of the terrain, something caught my attention. It was an old rifle, different from any other I had seen. Its design was unusual, with strange engravings and an air of antiquity that contrasted with the modernity of our weapons. I felt an irresistible urge to take it. As I did, a sensation of power surged through me. It was as if time had stopped around me, and a voice in my head whispered promises of greatness and victory. What I didn't know was the price we would pay for it. Since I found the rifle, things began to change.
My aim inexplicably improved, and every bullet I fired hit its mark with deadly precision. My comrades looked at me with a mix of admiration and fear, but inside me, something darker was beginning to awaken. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard its voice clearly for the first time. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a dominant presence that filled my mind with images of ancient battles and the faces of fallen soldiers crying out for revenge. The weapon had not only chosen me, it was using me to continue a war that had begun centuries ago. The following weeks were a whirlwind of successful operations. We became invincible, or so I thought. But with every enemy that fell, the voice grew stronger, more demanding. It started to demand more than just tactical victories. It wanted sacrifices. One night, after a particularly bloody ambush, the truth hit me with the force of a grenade. I saw their faces, the men I had killed, not just as enemies, but as lost souls dragged into the abyss by my hand. The weapon wasn't just consuming those who died by its bullets. It was also consuming me, feeding on my soul. I decided to confront the entity that resided within the rifle. One night under the moonlight, I confronted it. I screamed, I begged it to release me, but its response was a cold, cruel laugh that echoed in my head. However, I wasn't willing to give up. If that entity had found its way to me, I would find a way to expel it. My investigations led me to discover that the weapon had belonged to a soldier from a bygone era, a man who, like me, had been corrupted by its power. Only through an ancient ritual could I free myself, a ritual that required facing the spirits of those I had killed. With the help of a comrade who believed in the supernatural, I prepared the ritual. It was a moonless night, the kind of night that seems to devour all traces of light and hope. We placed the rifle in the center of a circle of ancient symbols and began to recite forgotten words, hoping it would be enough to break the curse. The spirits appeared one by one, confronting me not with violence, but with questions that cut deeper than any knife. Every answer I gave was a step toward my liberation or my condemnation. When the last spirit disappeared, the rifle disintegrated into a cloud of dark ashes, and the voice went silent forever. Years have passed since that night. I left the army and found peace in civilian life, but the shadows of those days never completely leave me. I now work with war veterans, helping others find their way back from the darkness, sharing my story as a warning about the hidden costs of power and war. Every person I talk to, every life I help rebuild offers me a bit of redemption. Although I know I can never fully atone for the lives lost by my hand, each day is an opportunity to do something good, to counteract the darkness with a bit of light. Sometimes on the loneliest nights, I can still hear an echo of that cold laugh, a sinister reminder that some battles are fought within. But now I am equipped with a different strength, a strength forged in understanding and repentance. This diary is my confession and my legacy. For those who read it, remember that in every choice we make, especially in times of war, we carry with us not only the responsibility for our actions, but also the consequences they can have on the soul. I hope my experience serves to dissuade others from taking dark paths in search of power or glory. The true courage, I have learned, lies in the ability to face our own demons and in the struggle to preserve humanity within ourselves and in others, even when all seems lost. As a soldier, I was trained to face the enemy without hesitation. As a man, I have had to learn to face myself. My greatest battle was not on the battlefield, but within me, and my greatest victory was not a medal or recognition, but the peace I finally found. This rifle, this possessed weapon, was both my greatest enemy and my hardest teacher. It taught me that in war, the most powerful weapons do not shoot bullets but wills and destinies. And ultimately, it taught me that the most important battle we can fight is the one to return home, not just in body but also in soul. It all began like any other day in the barracks. The morning was cold and gray, which seemed to foreshadow the somber atmosphere that would soon envelop our existence. "Form up!" Sergeant Martinez shouted with his authoritative voice that resonated in the cold air. We lined up, ready for another day of what we thought would be routine training.
Today will not be an ordinary day, soldiers. It will be a day you will remember for the rest of your lives. His tone was grave, but we didn't give it much importance. We thought it was just his way of motivating us. We were transported in trucks to an isolated area of the training field, an area we didn't recognize. They equipped us with what seemed to be live ammunition. Live ammunition, Sergeant? I asked, confused and somewhat alarmed. It's just part of the simulation, soldier. Today we're going to try something different. Act as if it were real, because for today's purposes it is, he replied with a look that brooked no argument. The exercise began with the usual noise of simulations, but something didn't feel right. The enemies seemed too coordinated, too real. And then the unthinkable happened. I saw Jimenez, one of my best friends, fall beside me with a visible bleeding wound in his chest. Everything stopped for a moment. "Man down! Man down! This is not a simulation!" I shouted, but the chaos had already erupted. The gunfire didn't cease, and with each passing minute, the line between training and reality blurred more. Soon we realized we were being hunted, not by foreign enemies, but by a section of our own army. But why? What's going on? Were the questions that echoed among us as we sought refuge. The hours passed, each more terrifying than the last. We discovered we were part of an experiment, a deadly game designed to test how far a soldier could go under maximum stress and real threat. With a small group of survivors, we managed to ambush one of our attackers. We disarmed him and demanded answers. "It's a loyalty and endurance test. Only the strongest will survive. It's what we need for the next phase," he mumbled, before a silencing shot ended his life, fired by one of our own who still believed blindly following orders was the right thing. Night fell upon us, bringing with it the weight of our actions and decisions. We were alone, betrayed by those we trusted most. We decided we wouldn't be lab rats in their macabre experiments. Armed with what we had gathered, we planned an escape that felt more like a suicide mission. But dying on our terms was better than being killed in their sick game. The escape was brutal. We lost more comrades, each death a permanent scar in my memory. But at dawn, the few of us who remained reached an outpost controlled by regular forces, who were surprised to see us emerging from the forest, bruised and bloody. The ensuing investigation was extensive and exhaustive. High-ranking officials were prosecuted. It was discovered that the deadly simulation was part of a larger plan to develop an elite unit capable of operating under the most extreme imaginable conditions. Many of those involved claimed it was necessary to prepare us for future threats. But for us survivors, it was just a senseless massacre. Although justice began to take shape, for those of us who survived, the battle was far from over. The ghosts of those days followed us wherever we went. Some found solace in the company of other veterans, others in the silence of solitude. I decided to write to give a voice to those who no longer had one and to process my own pain and confusion. Every word I wrote was a step toward my recovery, but also a stab of remembrance of the terror we had faced. By sharing our story, I hope to expose the depths of depravity that the human mind can reach, hidden behind the facade of military discipline and preparation for war. Over time, our group of survivors became a kind of family. We supported each other, knowing that each of us shared a piece of the same dark memory. We worked to rebuild our lives, but we knew some wounds would never fully heal. Now, years later, I look back not just to remember those we lost, but to remember why it is essential to fight against such atrocities. I now teach young cadets not only about tactics and strategy, but also about the ethics and morals that must guide a soldier. It is my way of ensuring the horror we lived through never repeats itself. This book is my testament and my challenge to future generations of soldiers and military leaders. Learn from our mistakes, embrace compassion, and remember that the true purpose of any great power is to protect, not destroy. It is my hope that by sharing this story, I can light a spark in the darkness, a spark that will one day dispel the shadows of that deadly simulation that marked our lives forever. After my discharge from service, civilian life felt like foreign terrain. Days passed with painful slowness, and every night was a struggle against the shadows of the war that refused to leave me. I never imagined that Marco's face,
My fallen comrade would become my constant companion, my personal torture. It was on one of those restless nights when I saw him for the first time. He was sitting on the edge of my bed, as real as any living person. "Why didn't you do more?" he asked with a voice that resonated deep within me. His presence was impossible, but there he was, accusing me with his eyes full of reproach. Every day, Marco reappeared, in the supermarket, in the park, in the quiet of my living room. There was no escape. "You should have saved me," he whispered, following me with every step I took. His words were like knives that pierced my guilt and remorse. Desperate, I sought help. Therapists listened, nodded, and offered words meant to be comforting, but nothing dispelled Marco's figure. "You're hallucinating. It's just PTSD," they explained. They prescribed medications, advised more therapy exercise, anything to distract my mind. But Marco never left. One night, tired of running, I decided to confront him. "Go away! Leave me alone!" I shouted at nothing, at the figure only I could see. But Marco approached, his face inches from mine. "I can't leave until you face what happened, until you face your truth." I took my old backpack and headed to the place where it all ended for Marco, the desert where we had served together. The journey was a pilgrimage, an attempt to seek answers or perhaps redemption. There in the vastness of the desert, Marco appeared once more. "It's time for you to see," he said, and the world around us began to change. Visions of battles, of decisions made in seconds, all replayed before me. I saw Marco falling, saw my hesitation, my fear. The reality of war, raw and unfiltered, unfolded before me. The visions showed me not only Marco's death, but also the times I had saved lives, the impossible decisions I had faced. War is not just death, it is also survival. It is humanity amid chaos, Marco said, his voice softer now. For the first time, I understood that his appearance was not a punishment, but a call to accept the complexity of my actions, of my decisions. Marco wanted me to find peace, not just with him, but with myself. After days in the desert, facing every demon, every shadow, I felt Marco begin to fade. "It's time for us both to find peace," he said, and with those words his figure began to dissipate like dust carried by the wind. I returned home feeling a lighter burden on my shoulders. It wasn't the end of the pain or the memory, but it was the beginning of acceptance. Marco no longer appeared, but his memory lived on, not as a ghost that haunted, but as a reminder that life, with all its pain and beauty, must be lived fully. Now, years after those dark days, I dedicate part of my time to talking with other veterans who struggle with their own ghosts. I share my story, not just as a testimony of war, but also as a hope that peace can be found. In meetings with other veterans, we openly talk about our experiences, our losses, and our steps towards healing. Marco's story has become a tool to help others understand that facing our fears and guilt is the first step to overcoming them. Therapy never really ended for me. It is a continuous process, a series of ups and downs that I handle with more grace now. I accepted that the path to recovery is often as unpredictable as the war itself, but every step forward is a triumph. Sometimes, when the night is especially quiet and the shadows of the past threaten to return, I remember Marco's voice telling me to find peace. Those words, though born from painful hallucinations, now serve as a beacon of hope. I decided to write a book about my experience, detailing not only the horrors of war, but also the journey towards post-traumatic recovery. The goal is clear, to show that even in the depths of despair, there is a light of hope. Over time, my story has gained recognition, not for the battles I fought on the field, but for the battle I won within my own mind. Both military and civilian institutions use my book as a resource to help those facing post-traumatic stress. Each day is a new dawn, an opportunity to live with the memory of Marco, not as a shadow that darkens my existence, but as a reminder of human resilience and strength. I have learned to live not only for myself, but for those who could not return home. In the quiet of the night, when the world seems to stop and I reflect on my journey, I find a peace I once thought impossible. Marco, my ghostly companion, taught me the most valuable lesson. Amid trauma and loss, there is always room for growth and redemption. His memory lives in every page I write, in every story I share, and in every sigh of relief I can now breathe freely. Thus, with each word, each encounter, and each shared memory, I move forward, forging a future where the past does not control but illuminates the path to healing. And on that path, I am finally at peace, accompanied not by ghosts but by the echoes of the lessons learned.
The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of gunfire and the sharp pain in my head. When I woke up, I found myself in a cold, damp cell with my hands tied and a throbbing pain reminding me I was alive, but barely.
"Where am I?" was the first question I murmured, though I knew no one would answer. It didn't take long before the cell door opened. A stern-looking man in an unfamiliar uniform entered. "Good morning, soldier. I have some questions for you," he said with a heavy accent I couldn't place. They started with standard questions about my unit and mission, but quickly turned to something I didn't expect. "Tell us about Project Eclipse," the interrogator demanded with a piercing look. "Project Eclipse? I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, but the expression on his face told me he didn't believe me. I realized they weren't interested in strategies or troop movements. They wanted information about a secret military experiment I had only heard whispers about in the dark hallways of my base. Days passed, and with each interrogation session, the pressure increased. They began showing me images and documents that were supposedly part of Project Eclipse. They talked about experimental weapons and climate manipulation, topics that sounded more like science fiction than reality. But every document I saw bore my government seal. One night, as I lay in the cell trying to understand what I really knew, the door opened silently. A woman I had seen briefly during my interrogations entered. "You don't have much time. You need to understand the gravity of what you know," she whispered quickly. She worked for an organization opposed to my government's experiments. According to her, Project Eclipse was real and far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The enemy wanted this technology not to stop it, but to use it. With the help of this woman, whose name I never knew, we planned an escape. It was risky and dangerous, but it was my only chance. One night, taking advantage of a guard change, and with my allies' complicity, I managed to get out of the cell in the base. Once safe, my mysterious savior shared more details. Project Eclipse was not only capable of altering the climate, but was originally designed to be a form of geophysical warfare, capable of devastating entire nations without deploying a single soldier. Knowing the truth put me in a moral dilemma. Should I expose my own government, potentially causing an international scandal and putting my life and my family's at risk? Or should I remain silent and hope the enemy didn't manage to replicate the technology? After many sleepless nights and long discussions with my ally, I decided I couldn't let such power fall into the wrong hands, whether they were my country's or anyone else's. I made the decision to leak the information to the international press, ensuring the world knew what was at stake. The consequences were immediate and severe. I was labeled a traitor by my government and a hero by others. But most importantly, Project Eclipse was halted, at least temporarily, while international investigations began. Public scrutiny and diplomatic pressure forced my government to dismantle the program and open its archives to international inspectors. My life changed forever. Under a new identity provided by the organization that helped me escape, I started living in a distant country, always looking over my shoulder, aware that there could still be repercussions. Tranquility had disappeared from my life, but I had gained some peace knowing I had done the right thing. Over time, I began to reflect on the weight of knowledge and the responsibility it entails. Every document I had seen and every word I had heard during my captivity resonated within me, reminding me of the power of information and how dangerous it can be. Despite the constant danger and life in exile, I found some redemption in helping others in similar situations. Working with non-governmental organizations and human rights groups, I used my experience and knowledge to prevent other experiments similar to Project Eclipse from taking place. My life had taken on a new purpose, Although I was no longer a soldier in the traditional sense, I continued fighting a different war, a war against the abuse of power and corruption. Every report I helped draft, every leak I coordinated was a step towards a safer world. Looking back, the journey from that dark cell to the present had been long and torturous. However, despite the challenges and sacrifices, I wouldn't change my actions. The world needed to know, and I had been the messenger. Sometimes the cost of truth is high, but the price of ignorance is much more devastating. Now I write these words not only as a testimony of what happened, but as a call to vigilance. Power, especially power that can alter the planet, must be rigorously controlled and supervised. My story is a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, the light of truth eventually finds its way. And as the ink flows on the paper, I know that although my role in this drama has ended, the story continues. Other people will take up the torch, and I hope they find inspiration in my story to act with courage, no matter the adversity. In a world where the truth is often stranger and more terrifying than fiction, the fight for justice and integrity never ends. It was a dark and stormy night when my nightmare began. I was driving my truck along a lonely highway somewhere in the Arizona desert. The full moon barely peeked through the clouds, casting eerie shadows over the arid landscape. I felt tired after a long day of driving, but knew I had to keep going to meet my delivery deadline. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated something on the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes and the truck screeched to a halt. There, in the flickering light of the headlights, I saw a scene I'll never forget. A man standing over a motionless body with a knife in his hand, the blade still dripping with fresh blood. My hands began to tremble on the steering wheel, and my heart pounded in my chest. "Shit, what do I do?" I asked aloud, trying to stay calm. I knew I couldn't stay there, but I also couldn't just drive away and pretend I hadn't seen anything. The man looked at me, and his expression changed from surprise to something darker. He started walking toward my truck with a sinister smile on his face. Without thinking twice, I floored the accelerator and sped away as fast as I could. The engine roared, and I felt the truck sway as I accelerated down the highway. For the next few minutes, my mind raced as fast as the truck's engine. Should I go to the police? What if that man followed me? I looked in the rearview mirror, but the darkness revealed nothing. I struggled to keep my eyes on the road while my mind filled with images of the bloody body and the man with the knife. Finally, I reached a service station that shone like a beacon in the night. I parked the truck and ran inside, seeking help. The woman behind the counter looked at me with concern. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. "No, I just saw a murder on the highway. I need to call the police," I said, trying to control my breathing. She nodded quickly and handed me the phone. I dialed the number with trembling hands, and in a few minutes, a calm voice answered on the other end. 911, what's your emergency?" "I saw a murder. A man with a knife on the highway near mile 127, I said, trying to sound as coherent as possible. "Stay on the line, sir. We will send a patrol immediately. Can you describe the man?" I gave the best description I could, recalling every detail my memory had captured in those brief seconds. The voice on the phone assured me that a patrol would arrive soon and that I should wait at the service station. A few minutes later, a couple of police patrols arrived. The officers quickly entered and asked me to repeat what I had seen. As I spoke, I noticed that one of them had a worried expression on his face. "Sir, we've received reports of a dangerous individual in this area. You described him exactly as others have. We've been looking for him for weeks," one of the officers said. I felt a chill run down my spine. What had I gotten myself into? The officers assured me they would do everything possible to capture the man and suggested I rest at a nearby motel, as it would be safer than continuing to drive that night. Reluctantly, I agreed and headed to the motel. Despite how tired I was, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the killer's face and the bloody body on the road. The image was etched in my mind. The next day I woke up with a start. There was a note under my door. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. The message was clear and terrifying. I saw you. You know what you saw. If you talk, I'll find you. Fear overwhelmed me. I knew I couldn't let the killer get away, but I also knew my life was in danger. I decided I had to move forward, find a way to bring that man to justice without risking my life. I returned to the service station, hoping to find the officers to tell them about the threat. But before I could get there, a black car pulled up beside me. The window slowly rolled down, and I saw the killer looking at me with those same cold, ruthless eyes. "I warned you, friend. Now it's your problem," he said, with a sinister smile before speeding off down the road. My heart raced. I knew I had to act quickly. I got back into the truck and started driving aimlessly just to get away from there. But I couldn't escape the fear that pursued me. I decided it was time to face my fears and use my wits to catch the killer. I called a friend, a former private detective, and told him everything. He advised we meet in a safe place and come up with a plan. We met in a nearby town where we discussed our options. "We have to catch this guy in the act. We need irrefutable proof," my friend said. "I have some contacts in the police who can help us, but we need a solid plan." We decided to set a trap. We knew the killer was following me, so we designed a scenario where it would appear I was alone and vulnerable in a secluded spot. My friend and the officers would be hiding, ready to act at the right moment. That night, I parked my truck in an old abandoned lot. I turned off the lights and waited. The hours passed slowly. Every noise made me jump. Finally, I saw the headlights of a car approaching. It was the killer. I took a deep breath and prepared for the final confrontation. The car stopped, and the man got out, knife in hand. He approached slowly, and when he was close enough, my friends and the officers sprang from their hiding places. "Stop! Police!" they shouted. The killer tried to run but was quickly surrounded and arrested. It was finally over. The man was brought to justice, and I could return to my life, though the images of that night would never completely fade. I had survived a nightmare using my wits and the help of good friends. Now, every time I drive those lonely roads, I remember that courage and justice will always prevail, even on the darkest nights. I reflect now as I look out the hospital window on that fateful journey. The road can be a treacherous place, and that particular stretch is a beast unto itself. If only I had heeded the old driver's warnings. My journey began like any other, a typical day for a trucker like me. The load was well secured, and the weather seemed perfect for a long trip across the state. I was at a gas station finishing up the refueling and checking the last details when I saw him. An old man with grey hair and sunken eyes from years of hard experiences on the road approached me with a slow but determined step. "Are you taking the route through Devil's Canyon?" he asked, his voice raspy as if carved from stone. "Yes. Why?" I replied, somewhat surprised by his tone of concern. "Be careful. That road has claimed more than one life. There are stories you wouldn't want to hear and curves you wouldn't want to take unprepared," he said, looking toward the horizon as if he could see the ghosts of past accidents. I smiled skeptically. Stories? Ghosts? It wasn't the first time I heard exaggerated warnings. After all, I was an experienced driver. With a slight gesture of my hand, I thanked him and climbed into the cab. "Thanks, old man, but I can handle it," I said with a confidence that now seems absurd. The trip passed without incident at first. The music played on the radio, and the road stretched out before me like an endless ribbon. Everything was going well until I reached the entrance of the canyon. The first miles were deceptively easy, but soon the curves began to tighten, and the fog thickened, creating an almost unreal atmosphere. It was then that I remembered the old driver's words. I started to feel a growing unease, but arrogance still kept me firm at the wheel. I slowed down a bit, but not enough. It was on one of those tight curves that I saw it. A shadow appeared in the middle of the road, almost human but with an unsettling presence. I braked hard, and I felt the rear wheels skid. The truck began to slide, and my heart pounded. "Damn it!" I shouted, trying to keep control. The truck wobbled, and before I knew it, we were off the road, falling over the edge of the canyon. The seconds felt like hours as the truck slid, crashing against rocks and flipping several times. The sound of metal against stone and breaking glass filled the air until everything finally stopped with a dull crunch. I woke up hanging from my seatbelt. The truck's cab shattered around me. The pain was intense, but nothing compared to the terror I felt realizing my situation. I tried to move, but each attempt was agony. The fog still enveloped the place, making everything seem like a terrifying dream. It was then I heard footsteps. I couldn't see through the fog, but I knew someone or something was approaching. I tried to scream for help, but my voice barely came out as a whisper. "Help!" I groaned. A figure appeared beside me. It was the old driver. His look showed no surprise, just deep sadness. "I warned you, kid, this place doesn't forgive arrogance," he said in a voice that now seemed almost ethereal. He disappeared as quickly as he had appeared, leaving me alone in the fog with the echo of his words resonating in my mind. I felt time stand still as darkness began to cover my vision. I didn't know how long I was there, but finally, the emergency sirens and flashing lights pulled me out of my stupor. The paramedics pulled me from the truck's wreckage and took me to the hospital. Now, as I look out the window, I reflect on that experience. The road is not just a path of asphalt and curves, but also a deadly trap for those who do not heed its warnings. If only I had listened to the old driver. It was a dark and stormy night on the road connecting Catemaco to Veracruz. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain fell so hard I could barely see through the truck's windshield. I'd heard stories about the witches of Catemaco since I started working as a trucker, but I'd always considered them mere legends to scare the rookies. That night, however, I discovered how wrong I was. It all began a few weeks ago when I made a delivery in Catemaco. It was a hot afternoon, and the sun shone intensely as I unloaded the truck. In the market, an old woman was selling herbs and amulets. She had a peculiar appearance, with her disheveled gray hair and deep eyes that seemed to look through my soul. I approached her out of curiosity. "Good afternoon, young man," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you interested in some protection?" "No, thanks," I replied, a bit uncomfortable. "I'm just passing through." "You shouldn't take these things lightly," she insisted, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "There are forces in this place you don't understand." I laughed nervously and walked away, but I could feel her gaze piercing my back as I left. I didn't think much more about the incident until strange things started happening during my trips. It began with minor breakdowns in the truck, things that a mechanic couldn't explain. Then I started having recurring nightmares, always with the same old woman staring at me with those dark eyes. One night, while driving on a deserted road, I saw a figure on the roadside. As I got closer, I recognized the old woman from Catemaco. She stood in the rain, motionless, staring at me. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't stop. As I passed her, I felt an icy chill run through my body, and the truck's engine suddenly died. I tried to restart it, but it wouldn't respond. I got out of the truck, instantly soaking wet, and checked the engine, finding nothing wrong. Suddenly I heard her voice behind me. "I warned you not to take this lightly." I turned, and there she was, with a severe expression on her face. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Then she extended a hand toward me, and I felt an invisible pressure squeezing my chest. I fell to my knees, struggling to breathe as the relentless rain continued to pour. "You need help, young man," the old woman said calmly. "There is a shaman in Veracruz who can save you. Seek Don Nicolas." She vanished as suddenly as she had appeared, and the truck's engine roared back to life. I stood up, trembling, not knowing if it had been real or a hallucination, but I knew I couldn't ignore what had just happened. The next day, I headed to Veracruz. I asked about Don Nicolas at every stop, and finally found someone who knew him. They directed me to a small cabin on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by dense, mysterious vegetation. Don Nicolas was an elderly man with deep wrinkles and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He greeted me with a calm smile and invited me in. "So the witches of Catemaco have sent you," he said while preparing an herbal infusion. "Tell me everything." I recounted what had happened since the encounter with the old woman, the nightmares, and the incident on the road. Don Nicholas listened attentively, nodding occasionally. "You have been marked by a powerful curse," he finally said. "The witches of Katako are known for their dark abilities. But don't worry, young man. There is a way to break this curse." He explained that we would need to perform a complex ritual using specific ingredients found only in the most remote places of the region. Over the next few days, we traveled together to collect what we needed: roots of rare plants, water from a sacred spring, and ashes from an extinct volcano. One night, under the full moon, Don Nicolas set up an altar in a clearing in the forest. He placed the ingredients in a circle and began chanting ancient hymns in a language I didn't recognize. The air was charged with electricity, and I could feel a dark presence lurking at the edge of the firelight. "You must enter the circle and remain still," he instructed. "No matter what happens, do not leave." I obeyed, and as Don Nicolas continued the ritual, a figure appeared in the darkness. It was the old woman from Katako, but her appearance had changed. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent fire, and her smile twisted into a sneer. "Do you think you can escape me?" she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on Don Nicolas's voice. The chanting grew more intense, and I felt a force pulling me toward the old woman. But I clung to the hope that the shaman knew what he was doing. Suddenly, the circle of fire burst into a blinding light. I opened my eyes and saw the old woman screaming, her figure dissolving into nothingness. I felt an overwhelming peace and knew the curse had been broken. Don Nicolas approached, exhausted but with a satisfied expression. "You did it, young man," he said. "But remember, there is always a price for dealing with the unknown. Be prudent in your travels and respect the forces you do not understand." I thanked Don Nicolas for saving my life and promised to be more cautious in the future. Since then, I have been more aware of the hidden dangers in the shadows of lonely roads. The stories of the witches of Katako no longer seem like mere legends, and I always carry a protective amulet as a reminder of that night when I faced true terror. It was a cold, dark night, typical of May on the lonely roads of Mexico. I had been driving for hours without stopping. The constant hum of the engine and the endless road were my only companions. Being a trucker isn't easy, but there are moments when you feel it's the perfect life, with the freedom of the open road ahead of you. That night, however, something changed. After many hours, I decided to stop at a roadside bar that seemed out of another era. The neon sign flickered, barely illuminating the name of the place, the Walker's Refuge. There weren't many trucks parked outside, so I assumed it would be a quiet place to rest for a while and have a drink. I walked in, and the atmosphere was cozy, but somewhat outdated. The dim light, the worn wooden tables, and a jukebox in the corner playing music from the 70s. I headed to the bar and ordered a double tequila. The bartender, an old man with a scar on his cheek, served me without saying a word. "Long way to go?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, I still have to get to Ciudad Juarez," I replied. Be careful. These roads can be treacherous at night," he said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. I nodded, not giving much importance to his warning. Then I saw her. She was a beautiful woman sitting alone at a table in the back of the bar. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the dim light, and her black hair cascaded over her shoulders. Her dark, deep eyes met mine, and she smiled. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but curiosity was stronger. I approached her table with my tequila in hand. "May I sit down?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Sure, join me," she replied in a soft, melodious voice. We introduced ourselves and started talking. Her name was Anna, and she said she was just passing through, like me. The conversation flowed surprisingly naturally, and soon I was mesmerized by her words and beauty. "Would you like to go for a walk?" she suddenly asked, standing up from the table. "There's a place nearby I want to show you." Although a part of me felt something was wrong, I couldn't resist.
We left the bar and walked along a path that led into the nearby woods. The night was darker than ever, and the only sound was the crunching of our footsteps on the dry leaves. "Here it is," she finally said, stopping in a clearing illuminated by the moon. The place had a strange, almost surreal atmosphere. Anna turned to me, her eyes shining with an intensity I'd never seen before. "Do you know the legend of the Black Widow?" she asked, her voice now deeper. I shook my head, feeling fear start to creep in. "They say she was a beautiful woman who lost her husband in a tragic accident. Since then, her spirit roams these roads, seeking company. But her pain has turned her into something darker. She is said to seduce men, leading them to their doom." Before I could react, Anna transformed before my eyes. Her face became cadaverous, and her once charming eyes were now dark, empty pits. I tried to back away, but something held me paralyzed. "You can't escape," she whispered, moving closer. "Now you are mine." With a desperate effort, I managed to break free and run back to the bar. My legs were trembling and my heart was racing. When I arrived, the bartender was there, waiting for me. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said somberly. I nodded, unable to speak. "Many have fallen into her trap, but few managed to escape. You are lucky. She is the Black Widow." I never returned to that bar or that road. From that night on, I always was careful with the people I met on my travels. And every time someone tells me about strange encounters on the road, I tell them my story, hoping they take the warning seriously. Because I know she is still out there, looking for her next victim.